The envelope shook in Eleanor Whitmore's gloved hand as she tore it open on the empty depot platform. 4 words stopped her heart. I cannot go through with this. No name, no goodbye. No man waiting to marry her. Just dust, silence, and a promise turned to ash beneath a Montana sky. She had crossed 1,000 miles for a stranger's letters, and he wasn't even brave enough to face her. Behind her, the last train's whistle faded into nothing. Ahead of her, an unknown cowboy on a dark horse was about to change everything. Nếu bạn yêu thích những câu chuyện miền Tây đầy cảm xúc như thế này, hãy nhận đăng ký kênh ngay bây giờ và theo dõi câu chuyện của Eleanor đến tận phút cuối cùng. Đừng quên để lại bình luận cho tôi biết bạn đang xem từ thành phố nào. Tôi rất muốn biết câu chuyện này đã đi xa đến đâu. The letter had promised her a new life. What she got instead was an empty platform and a folded piece of paper that felt heavier than the suitcase in her other hand. Eleanor Whitmore read the 4 sentences 3 times, as if repetition might change their meaning. I cannot go through with this. Forgive me. That was all Thomas Grayson had left her. No signature, no explanation, not even the courage to say it to her face. Around her, the platform emptied in pieces. A young mother swept her children into the arms of a waiting husband. 2 ranch hands loaded crates onto a wagon, laughing about something that had nothing to do with her. An older gentleman tipped his hat to a woman running toward him. Her skirts gathered in her fists, joy written plainly across her face. Everyone had somewhere to go. Everyone had someone waiting. Eleanor stood in the middle of all that reunion, holding a letter from a man who had decided, somewhere between his last correspondence and this morning, that she wasn't worth the trouble of even meeting. The station clerk approached her carefully, the way a man approaches something that might break if he moves too fast. Miss Whitmore. She looked up. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Yes, I'm real sorry. Mr. Grayson left that with me 2 days back. Told me to give it to you when you arrived. He hesitated. I didn't read it. Wasn't my business. No, Eleanor said. It wasn't. The clerk shifted his weight, clearly wanting to say more and not knowing how. Is there anyone else you're expecting? Someone I could send word to. Eleanor folded the letter along its original creases, slow and deliberate, like she was folding away a piece of herself along with it. No. Family in the territory. No. A place you're staying tonight. She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she tightened her grip on the handle of her suitcase until her knuckles went white beneath her gloves. Not yet. The clerk's face fell into something between pity and helplessness, and Eleanor hated both of those things more than she hated the empty platform. She had seen that look before. She had crossed half a country trying to outrun it. I have $3.40, she said more to herself than to him. I imagine that won't buy much of a future. Miss, You've done your job, Eleanor said, cutting him off gently. Thank you for delivering the letter. I won't keep you. The clerk lingered a moment longer, then walked back toward the station house, glancing over his shoulder twice before he disappeared through the door. Eleanor watched him go and felt something close over inside her chest. Some door she had spent the whole train ride west trying to pry open. She had believed those letters. God help her, she had believed every single word. I've built something here, Miss Whitmore. Something I'd be proud to share. A house that needs a woman's hand. A life that needs a partner who isn't afraid of hard work. She had read that line so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold. I know we've never met, but I feel I know you already. Your letters carry more honesty than anything I've heard in this territory in years. She had believed that too. She had packed her whole life into 2 trunks and a suitcase because a stranger's handwriting had made her feel for the first time in 3 years like somebody wanted her. Now she was standing on a platform in Silver Creek, Montana, with the sun beginning its long slide toward the mountains, and the only thing waiting for her was a folded piece of paper telling her she wasn't worth the walk to the depot. Coward. The word rose up in her before she could stop it, hot and furious, and for one dangerous moment Eleanor let herself feel the full weight of it. The humiliation, the rage, the bone-deep exhaustion of being left behind by yet another man who had promised her something and given her nothing. Then she made herself breathe. She would not cry on this platform. She had promised herself that much crossing 3 states and a territory line. She would not give Silver Creek the satisfaction of watching Eleanor Whitmore fall apart in public. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward town. Silver Creek was smaller than she'd imagined. A single main street lined with a mercantile, a bank, a hotel, with peeling paint, and a saloon that already had 2 men leaning against its doorframe, watching her with open curiosity. Eleanor kept her chin level and her eyes forward. She had learned that trick a long time ago. Walk like you belong somewhere, even when you don't, especially when you don't. It was the only armor she had left. The hotel clerk behind the front desk was a heavy-set man with a mustache that twitched when he spoke. "Help you, miss?" "A room, please, just for the night." "That'll be $1.50. Eleanor's stomach dropped, but she kept her face still. "I can pay for 1 night." "Payment up front," the clerk said, holding out his hand. She counted out the coins, slowly watching the small pile of everything she had left disappear across the counter. When she was done, she had $1.90 standing between her and absolutely nothing. "Room's up the stairs, 3rd door," the clerk said, already looking past her toward the next customer, though there was no one behind her. "Breakfast ends at 7. Thank you." Eleanor climbed the stairs with her suitcase banging against her leg, found the 3rd door, and let herself into a room that smelled like tobacco and old linens. She set her suitcase on the bed and sat down beside it, and for the first time since the platform, she allowed herself one long, shaking breath. What now? She had no family to write to. She had made sure of that before she ever boarded the first train, burned every bridge that might have let her old life reach out and drag her back. She had no husband waiting, no job secured, no plan beyond the one that had just collapsed on a train platform in front of strangers. She had $3 minus the room. She had 2 trunks somewhere at the depot she hadn't even had the strength to collect yet. And she had a letter folded in her pocket from a man who apparently hadn't even been brave enough to look her in the eye and tell her he'd changed his mind. I cannot go through with this. What exactly, she wondered, staring at the water-stained ceiling, had he not been able to go through with marrying a stranger, marrying her specifically? Had he heard something? Had someone told him about the scandal she'd left behind, the one she'd crossed a country to escape? Her stomach twisted at the thought, and she pushed it down hard. It didn't matter why. It only mattered that she was alone in a town she didn't know with almost nothing to her name. She would find work. She had to. The next morning, Eleanor walked the length of Silver Creek's main street, twice stopping at every establishment that might need a woman's hands. The mercantile owner, a thin woman with sharp eyes, looked her up and down before she'd even finished asking. "We're not hiring." "I could do bookkeeping. I'm quite good with figures." "I said we're not hiring." The door didn't quite slam, but it closed with enough finality that Eleanor understood the conversation was over. At the boarding house, the landlady was kinder, but no more helpful. "I'd take you on if I had the work, dear, truly I would. But my daughter does the cooking and cleaning both. I've nothing to give you." At the bank, the manager barely looked up from his desk. "We don't employ women, miss. Never have." By midday, Eleanor had knocked on 7 doors and been turned away from all 7. She stood outside the saloon, the last establishment on the street she hadn't yet tried, and told herself she wasn't desperate enough for that. Not yet. She was wrong. By late afternoon, she was desperate enough to try. The saloon owner, a broad man with tired eyes, looked at her like she'd asked him something absurd. "This ain't that kind of establishment, miss, and even if it were, I've got no want of your kind of help. You'd best move along." Eleanor felt her face go hot. "I meant cleaning, serving meals, nothing more." "I know what you meant," the man said, not unkindly but firm. "And my answer's still no. A woman alone asking for work in a saloon, that's a fast way to get talked about in a town this size. Do yourself a favor and don't ask again." She left with her ears burning and her pride in tatters. And by the time she made it back to the hotel, she had exactly $1.10 left to her name and a room she could no longer afford past tonight. She sat on the edge of the bed and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding all day. One more night if she was careful. Maybe two if she skipped meals. After that, she had no earthly idea what she would do. I refuse to write home, she told herself, gripping the thought like a rope over a canyon. I refuse to crawl back and let them say they were right about me. But refusing to crawl back didn't put a roof over her head. It didn't fill a stomach that had gone empty since yesterday's train breakfast. It didn't change the fact that she was a stranger in a town that had no interest in giving her a chance. That night, Eleanor lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the saloon down the street, and made herself a promise. Tomorrow she would collect her trunks from the depot, sell whatever she could bear to part with, and figure out a way forward. She had survived worse than this. She had survived being cast out by her own family, being whispered about by people who had known her since childhood, being made to feel like the worst thing that had ever happened to her hometown. She could survive one abandoned engagement in a town called Silver Creek. She had to believe that. It was the only thing keeping her upright. The next evening, with her last coins spent on a loaf of bread and her trunks retrieved from the depot and left temporarily with a sympathetic station master who agreed to hold them for a few days, Eleanor found herself walking the road out of town as the sun sank low and orange behind the western ridgeline. She wasn't running away, not exactly. She simply couldn't bear to sit in that hotel room another hour waiting for a solution that wasn't coming. Walking at least gave her something to do with the fear clawing at her chest. The road narrowed as it left the edge of town, cutting through open grassland that stretched toward mountains she couldn't yet name. The evening air had a bite to it sharper than she expected for summer, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had made it perhaps half a mile when she heard hooves behind her, slow and unhurried, and a voice cut through the darkening quiet. "You're heading into open country after sunset with one bag and no lantern." Eleanor spun around, her heart lurching into her throat. A man sat astride a dark horse a few paces behind her, his hat pulled low enough that she couldn't fully see his face in the fading light. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't threatening either. He simply sat there watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I didn't ask for company," Eleanor said, proud of how level her voice came out despite the way her pulse was hammering. "No," the man agreed. "You didn't." He swung down from the horse in one smooth motion and stood there holding the reins loosely, making no move to approach her further. Up close, in the last of the light, she could see he was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved by years of wind and work, rather than years of ease. There was something guarded in his eyes, something that matched the wariness she felt in her own chest. "You don't know me," Eleanor said. "No." "Then why are you following me?" He glanced past her down the empty road, stretching toward the darkening mountains, then back at her face. "Because I know what it looks like when someone's got nowhere to go. I've seen that look before." The words landed harder than she expected, and for one humiliating second, she felt her eyes sting. She blinked it back fast, furious at herself for how easily this stranger had seen straight through the armor she'd been wearing for 2 days. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs," she said. "I didn't say you weren't." "Then what exactly are you offering, Mr. Walker? Caleb Walker." He said it plainly, without flourish, the way a man says his own name when he has nothing to hide behind it. "I own a ranch a few miles out from town, Walker Ridge." "And what does Walker Ridge have to do with me?" "I need someone to run the house, keep accounts, manage meals for 8 ranch hands who eat like they've never seen food before." He said it flatly, almost businesslike, though something in his tone suggested he'd rehearsed this offer more than once in his head before finding the nerve to say it aloud. "It's honest work, fair wages, a room of your own." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching his face for whatever angle he might be working. In her experience, men who offered kindness to strange women on empty roads usually wanted something in return, and she had learned at great cost exactly what that something usually was. "Do you offer employment to every woman you happen to find walking alone at dusk, Mr. Walker?" "No." "Then why me?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped, gone rougher around the edges. "Because you're walking down a road with nowhere to sleep tonight and a face that's trying real hard to look like it isn't scared. I recognize that look because I've worn it myself." He paused. "I'm not offering you charity, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor Whitmore. Miss Whitmore. I'm offering you a chance. What you do with it is your business." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd been holding shut with both hands since the moment she'd read that letter on the platform. She hated how badly she wanted to say yes. She hated how much she wanted to trust a stranger's word again, after the last stranger's word had left her stranded with nothing. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked. "How do I know this isn't some kind of—" "You don't," Caleb said simply. "You've got no way to know that. You'll just have to decide if you trust your own judgment enough to take the risk." It wasn't reassurance. It wasn't a promise. It was, she realized, the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she'd stepped off that train. "I can work," she said, lifting her chin. "I don't need charity. I already told you, I'm not offering any." "Then what are your terms?" "Room and board. Fair wage paid monthly. You keep the house running, manage the accounts, help with meals. In return, you've got a roof and a locked door, and nobody asking questions about where you came from." He met her eyes directly. "That last part usually matters most to folks in your situation. Figured it might matter to you too." Eleanor's throat tightened. He wasn't wrong. It mattered more than he could possibly know. "And if I refuse, then I'll see you get back to town safe, and you can figure out your own way from there. I'm not in the business of forcing anybody into anything." He swung back up onto his horse with the same easy motion he'd used to dismount. "But it gets cold out here fast once the sun's down. Miss Whitmore, and Silver Creek's not exactly overflowing with opportunity for a woman on her own. That much I'd wager you've already learned today." She had. God help her, she had learned that lesson thoroughly over the last 2 days, door by closing door. "Walker Ridge," she repeated slowly. "How far?" 4 miles. "And you expect me to simply climb onto a horse with a man I met 5 minutes ago and ride into the dark?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close to one. "I expect you to make whatever decision keeps you safest tonight. If that's coming with me, my horse can carry 2. If that's walking back to town, I'll ride behind you the whole way to make sure you get there without trouble. Your choice, Miss Whitmore. Always will be long as you're on my land." That last line did something strange to her chest. Your choice. Always will be. She had not heard anyone say those words to her in longer than she cared to remember. Not her family. Not Thomas Grayson, who had made the choice to abandon her without ever once asking what she wanted. Not anyone. She looked at the road ahead of her, dark and empty and leading nowhere she could name. She looked at the road behind her, leading back to a town that had shut every door in her face. And she looked at this stranger on his dark horse, offering her nothing but honest work, and a locked door expecting nothing from her but the labor she was already prepared to give. "All right," she said finally. "I'll come. But I intend to earn my keep, Mr. Walker. I won't have anyone accusing me of taking charity I didn't work for." "Didn't figure you would," Caleb said, and there was something almost like respect in the way he said it. He reached down and offered his hand. "Ranch is 4 miles out. We should get moving before it gets fully dark." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before she placed her hand in his and let him pull her up behind him onto the horse. It felt strange sitting there with her arms hovering uncertainly, unsure whether to hold on to him or the saddle or nothing at all. "You'll want to hold on," Caleb said over his shoulder. "Road gets rough past the creek crossing." She held on, and as the horse started forward into the deepening blue of evening, carrying her away from a town that had rejected her toward a ranch she'd never seen, owned by a man she'd known for less than 10 minutes, Eleanor Whitmore felt something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon after the platform. She felt for the first time in 2 days like she might actually survive this. The ride to Walker Ridge passed mostly in silence, broken only by the rhythm of hooves against packed dirt and the occasional creak of saddle leather. Eleanor watched the darkening landscape roll past endless grassland, giving way to scattered stands of pine as they climbed toward higher ground, and found herself studying the back of Caleb Walker's shoulders, trying to read the measure of the man she'd just agreed to work for. "You're quiet," she finally said, when the silence stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable. "Didn't figure you wanted conversation given the day you've had." "How would you know what kind of day I've had?" Clerk at the depot mentioned a woman who arrived on the afternoon train and never got collected. Word travels fast in a town this size. He didn't turn around, but she caught the edge in his voice, not unkind, but careful. "Man who left you standing there. He local." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "He was supposed to be. Thomas Grayson. Perhaps you know him." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Can't say I do. Silver Creek's bigger than it looks from the depot. Lot of ranches scattered through the territory carrying names I've never heard." "I see." "You don't have to talk about it," Caleb said. "Wasn't asking out of curiosity. Just wanted to know if I needed to worry about him showing up at my ranch causing trouble." "He won't." Eleanor's voice came out harder than she intended. "He made his intentions perfectly clear. I doubt Mr. Grayson has any interest in seeing me again, and I certainly have none in seeing him." "Fair enough." They rode in silence again after that, and Eleanor found herself grateful for it. She wasn't ready to explain the humiliation of the platform to a stranger, wasn't ready to relive the 4 sentences that had ended whatever future she'd imagined for herself in Montana. The ranch came into view as full dark settled over the land, a scattering of lantern light from a low, sprawling house, a barn beyond it, and the shapes of outbuildings she couldn't yet identify. Somewhere in the darkness, she could hear cattle restless and lowing, and the distant bark of a dog. "Walker Ridge," Caleb said, bringing the horse to a stop in the yard. "Not much to look at in the dark, but you'll see it proper come morning." He swung down and reached up to help her, and Eleanor accepted his hand again, sliding down from the horse with legs stiff from the ride. Her whole body ached with exhaustion, 2 sleepless nights, 2 days of rejection, and now this strange new uncertainty stretching out ahead of her. The front door of the house opened, spilling lantern light across the yard, and a woman stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Caleb, who's this you've brought home?" "This is Miss Whitmore," Caleb said. "She'll be running the house going forward." "Eleanor, this is Martha. She's kept things patched together around here longer than she probably wants credit for." Martha, a stout woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked Eleanor over with an expression that mixed curiosity with something sharper suspicion maybe, or simple exhaustion at the idea of a stranger stepping into her domain. "Running the house," Martha repeated slowly. "That's so. Martha's been doing double duty since Mrs. Lindqvist left in the spring," Caleb explained. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, and trying to keep 8 grown men from tearing the place apart. She'll be glad for the help whether she says so tonight or not." "I can speak for myself, Caleb Walker," Martha said, though there wasn't much bite in it. She turned her attention back to Eleanor, studying her face in the lantern light. "You know anything about running a household, Miss Whitmore, or is this charity work Caleb's taken it into his head to do?" Eleanor felt her spine straighten. "I managed my family's household from the age of 16, Mrs. Just Martha. Martha, I can keep accounts, manage a kitchen, oversee staff, and handle correspondence. I don't require anyone's charity. I intend to earn every dollar of my wage." Something in Martha's expression softened just slightly. "Well, at least you've got some fire in you. That'll serve you better than manners around here, I'll tell you that much." She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in out of the cold, both of you. Supper's gone cold twice over. Waiting on Caleb might as well feed the both of you before it's ruined a 3rd time." The inside of the house was plain but sturdy. A large kitchen with a long table, a sitting room with well-worn furniture, and the warm smell of something that had once been stew before it sat too long on the stove. Eleanor felt the exhaustion of the last 2 days finally catch up with her all at once, and she had to grip the back of a chair to steady herself. Caleb noticed. "You should eat something and get some rest. Martha can show you to a room. We'll talk particulars in the morning." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and meant it more than the simple words could carry. Caleb nodded once, his expression unreadable in the low lantern light, and turned to head back toward the door. He paused there, hand on the frame, and looked back at her. "For what it's worth, Miss Whitmore, whatever that man did to you back at that depot, it says something about him, not about you." He said it plainly, without softness, the way he seemed to say everything. "Get some rest." Then he was gone out into the dark toward the barn, and Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen of a stranger's ranch house, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon. She felt, however, faintly, like maybe she hadn't reached the end of every road after all. Yow! That first night, Eleanor lay in the narrow bed of the small room Martha had shown her to clean simple, with a window that looked out over dark pasture land, and found sleep slower to come than exhaustion should have allowed. Her mind kept circling back to the platform, to the letter, to 4 sentences that had unmade every plan she'd built her escape around. "I cannot go through with this. Forgive me." She still didn't know what this meant. Marrying her specifically. Marrying anyone at all. Or had someone finally told him the truth about why she'd really left the East, the scandal that had chased her out of her old life, the lies that had painted her as something she wasn't? She pushed the thought down hard, the way she'd been pushing it down for weeks. It didn't matter now. Thomas Grayson was a closed door, and she had, against every expectation, found herself standing in front of an open one instead. A cowboy with tired eyes and no interest in her past. A ranch that needed a woman's hand. A room with a lock on the door, and nobody for now asking questions she couldn't afford to answer. It wasn't the life she'd crossed the country for. But it was for tonight enough. Eleanor closed her eyes, and for the first time in 2 days, sleep came without a fight. Morning at Walker Ridge arrived loud and early. The clatter of pots in the kitchen below, the distant shouts of ranch hands, calling to one another in the yard, the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifting up through the floorboards. Eleanor dressed quickly and made her way downstairs to find Martha already elbow-deep in breakfast preparations, sweat beading at her temples despite the early hour. "You're up early," Martha said, not looking up from the skillet in front of her. "Most folks Caleb brings on take a day or two to find their feet." "I told you, I intend to earn my keep." Eleanor tied on the apron hanging by the door and looked around the kitchen, taking stock. "Where would you like me to start?" Martha glanced at her sideways, something like surprise flickering across her weathered face. "You're serious?" "Entirely." "Well then." Martha gestured toward a stack of dishes piled in the wash basin, then toward a ledger sitting untouched on a side table, its pages curling at the edges from disuse. "Accounts haven't been touched proper in near a month. Numbers are a mess. If you're half as good with figures as you claim, that'd be a mercy to start." Eleanor picked up the ledger and flipped through it, her trained eye immediately catching errors, missing entries, columns that didn't add correctly. It was chaos, the kind of chaos that told her nobody on this ranch had the time or the skill to manage it properly. "I can have this sorted within the week," she said. "We'll see," Martha said, though there was less doubt in her voice than before. By midday, Eleanor had reorganized half the ledger, prepared a list of outstanding accounts that needed attention, and helped Martha serve the noon meal to 8 hungry ranch hands who eyed the new face at the stove with open curiosity, but said little beyond polite thanks. All except one. A lean, weathered man who introduced himself as Sam Dawson, the ranch foreman, lingered at the table after the others had gone back to work, watching Eleanor with an expression that wasn't unkind, but wasn't entirely trusting either. "You're the one Caleb picked up off the road," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Don't mean any disrespect, Miss Whitmore, but Caleb doesn't usually go bringing strangers home. Never has long as I've known him, which is going on 9 years now." Sam leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Makes a man wonder what's different about you." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, refusing to let the question rattle her. "I imagine Mr. Walker can answer that better than I can. All I can tell you is that I intend to do honest work and earn my place here. Nothing more complicated than that." Sam considered this for a long moment, then gave a short nod, as if she'd passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. "Fair enough. Ranch could use the help, and Martha's been run ragged since spring. Just don't go breaking anything that's not already broken, if you understand my meaning." "I understand perfectly," Eleanor said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. There was something in the way he said it, careful, protective, that suggested there was more to Caleb Walker's story than a simple need for household help. She would learn what that meant soon enough. For now, she had a ledger to finish and a kitchen to help run. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, a purpose to fill her hands and her mind, instead of grief. Caleb didn't return to the house until well after dark that first full day. And when he did, he found Eleanor still bent over the ledger at the kitchen table, a single lamp burning low beside her. "You're still working," he said, more observation than question. "I wanted to finish before I slept. The accounts were badly behind." She didn't look up from the columns of figures in front of her. "You've been paying Hendricks at the feed store nearly 20% more than the going rate for grain. I don't know if that was intentional, but if it wasn't, it's costing you a considerable sum." Caleb crossed the kitchen and looked over her shoulder at the ledger close enough that she caught the smell of hay and horse and long hours of work clinging to him. Hadn't noticed that. No one had time to notice from the state these books were in. She finally looked up at him. "I can renegotiate the terms if you'd like. I have some experience with that sort of thing." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or the beginning of something like trust. "You're full of surprises, Miss Whitmore. I told you, I don't take charity." "No," Caleb agreed, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down, weariness settling into his shoulders now that the day's work was done. "I'm starting to see that." They sat in silence for a moment, the lamp flickering between them, and Eleanor found herself studying his face in a way she hadn't allowed herself to on the ride out from town. There was something guarded there, something carved deep by years she couldn't guess at, but underneath it, something that looked almost like relief. Like a man who had been carrying a weight alone for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to share it. "Martha said you've never brought anyone home before," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. "Sam said the same." Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly. "They talk too much." "Is it true?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the lamp flame like it might offer him the right words. "I lost my wife 6 years back. Fever took her fast 3 days and she was gone. Since then I haven't had much use for company. Easier to keep the house quiet than to fill it with people who'd just remind me of what isn't there anymore." Eleanor's chest tightened, an ache of recognition she hadn't expected. "I'm sorry." "Wasn't looking for sympathy, just answering your question." He met her eyes, something steady and unflinching in his gaze. "Guess I saw something on that road yesterday that reminded me what it looks like when someone's lost and got nowhere to turn. Figured I understood that better than most." "And that's the only reason?" Eleanor asked, unsure why she needed to know only that she did. "That's the only reason," Caleb said. "Nothing more complicated than that. You needed work. I needed help running this place. Rest is just circumstance." Eleanor nodded slowly, though something in her chest didn't quite believe the simplicity of his answer, and something in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely sure he believed it either. "Well," she said, closing the ledger and standing. "Regardless of the reason, I intend to make certain you don't regret the decision, Mr. Walker." "Caleb," he said, "if you're going to be running my household, seems foolish to keep standing on formality." "Caleb, then." She allowed herself the smallest smile, the first one she'd managed in 2 days. "Good night." "Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Eleanor," she said, echoing his own words back to him. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face before he caught it and smoothed it away. "Eleanor, good night." She left him there in the kitchen, the lamp still burning low, and climbed the stairs to her room, with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling into her chest, something she hadn't felt since long before Thomas Grayson's letters had ever arrived in her mailbox. It felt cautiously, dangerously like hope. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Eleanor hadn't known she was starving for. Mornings began before dawn, with bread rising and coffee brewing, and the accounts waiting patiently on the side table for whatever hour she could steal to attend to them. Afternoons were filled with the endless small labors of running a household, mending, cleaning, managing supplies. Learning the particular preferences of 8 ranch hands who slowly, cautiously, began to warm to the new woman running their kitchen. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had renegotiated the grain contract with Hendricks, saving Walker Ridge nearly $11 a month. She had reorganized the household accounts into a system so clean that even Sam Dawson, skeptical as he'd been admitted, it made his own job easier. She had learned the names of every ranch hand, remembered who took their coffee black and who needed extra sugar, who was nursing a sore shoulder from a fall off a green horse and needed lighter duties for a few days. And slowly, carefully, she had begun to notice things about Caleb Walker that unsettled her in ways she wasn't prepared for. The way he never raised his voice even when a hand made a costly mistake. The way he sat up some nights, long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at something only he could see, a grief, still fresh enough to keep him from sleep. The way he watched her sometimes across the kitchen table. Quick glances he thought she didn't notice, gone the moment she looked up. She told herself it meant nothing. She had come to Silver Creek believing in a stranger's promises once already. And look where that had landed her, abandoned on a platform with nothing but a folded letter and a suitcase. She would not make that mistake again. But there were moments, small ones, unguarded ones, that made the resolution harder to hold on to than she wanted to admit. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her time at Walker Ridge, Eleanor found herself sitting alone on the porch after supper, the ledger forgotten in her lap, watching the sun sink behind the mountains in streaks of orange and violet. She heard the door open behind her and didn't need to turn to know it was Caleb. "You should be resting," he said, settling into the chair beside hers without asking permission, the way he'd started doing more often these past few evenings. "You've been running yourself ragged since you got here." "I could say the same of you." "Different kind of tired." He was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset alongside her. "You don't have to prove yourself every hour of every day, you know. Nobody here doubts you're capable." Eleanor felt the familiar prickle of defensiveness rise in her chest, the same instinct that had carried her through years of being underestimated, dismissed, blamed for things that weren't her fault. "I don't know any other way to be." "Who taught you that?" Caleb asked, and something in his voice was gentler than she'd heard from him before, careful in a way that made her chest ache. Eleanor looked away, out toward the darkening pastures. "People who promised they would protect me. And didn't." Caleb didn't push further, didn't ask the question hovering behind his eyes. He simply sat there beside her in the gathering dark, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, without either of them acknowledging it, and let the silence hold whatever she wasn't ready to say. "For what it's worth," he finally said, "nobody here is going to make you a promise they don't intend to keep. That's not how I run things. Never has been." Eleanor turned to look at him, searching his face in the fading light for any sign that he was simply saying what she wanted to hear. She found none. Only the same steady honesty she'd seen in him since the moment he'd stopped his horse on that empty road and told her plainly what he was and wasn't offering. "Why does that matter to you?" she asked quietly. "My trust. Why would a stranger care whether I trust him or not?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on an answer he wasn't quite ready to give voice to. "Because I know what it costs a person to trust again after they've been left standing somewhere they didn't deserve to be left," he said finally. "And I'd rather earn that from you slow and honest than lose it fast because I made you a promise I couldn't keep." The words settled into Eleanor's chest like something warm and dangerous cracking further into the wall she'd spent 2 days, no longer than that. Years longer, building around herself. She didn't have a response ready. For the first time since the platform, since the letter, since every closed door in Silver Creek, she found herself, without the words to protect herself from what she was starting to feel. So she said nothing at all, and simply sat there beside him as the last light faded from the sky, letting the silence between them carry a promise neither of them was ready to speak aloud. It was 3 days later, that the first sign of trouble arrived at Walker Ridge, though Eleanor didn't recognize it for what it was until much later. A rider came through in the early afternoon, a stranger in a well-tailored coat that looked out of place against the dust and grit of the territory, asking questions at the mercantile in town that made their way back to the ranch by evening, carried on Sam Dawson's tongue, and a frown that hadn't left his face since he'd heard them. "Fella was asking after a woman," Sam said, finding Eleanor in the kitchen as she prepared the evening meal. "Description matched you close enough it made the hair stand up on my neck. Said he was looking for someone who might have come through on the Eastern train recent. Offered money to anyone with information." Eleanor's hands went still over the pot she'd been stirring, a cold feeling spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Did he give a name?" she asked, careful to keep her voice level. "Didn't catch one. Fella from the mercantile said he had city manners and city money, but wouldn't say who he was working for." Sam studied her face carefully. "You know something about this Miss Whitmore?" Eleanor forced a smile that felt brittle even to her. "I can't imagine who would be looking for me, Sam. I don't know a soul in this territory." But even as she said it, a name rose unbidden in her mind. A name she had crossed half a country trying to outrun a name attached to documents, hidden at the bottom of her trunk, and a truth she had told no one, not even the man who had pulled her off a lonely road and given her a chance at a new life. Richard Vale. She had told herself, boarding that train weeks ago, that she had covered her tracks well enough. That the distance between the East and Montana Territory would be enough to keep her safe, to keep the evidence she carried out of reach of the man who wanted it silenced along with her. Now, standing in Caleb Walker's kitchen, with Sam Dawson's careful eyes fixed on her face, Eleanor understood with sudden sickening clarity that she had been wrong. Whatever peace she had found in the 2 weeks since that empty platform, the ledgers set right, the kitchen warm, with new purpose, the careful, dangerous hope growing in her chest. Every time Caleb Walker looked at her across the table, all of it was standing on ground far less solid than she'd let herself believe. Somewhere out there, a stranger with city manners and city money was asking questions with her description attached to them, and Eleanor had a terrible certain feeling that this was only the beginning. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed with the ledger closed on the nightstand, and Sam Dawson's words circling in her mind like carrion birds. A fella asking after a woman. City manners and city money. She told herself it could be anyone. A land agent. A traveling salesman looking for a runaway wife who owed him nothing. 100 harmless explanations that had nothing to do with the trunk sitting locked at the bottom of the wardrobe, or the documents folded inside a false bottom she'd sewn herself somewhere outside St. Louis. But she knew better. She had known the moment Sam said city manners, that the peace she'd found in 2 short weeks was already cracking at the edges. By morning, she had made a decision. She would say nothing. Not to Caleb, not to Martha, not to Sam. She would watch and wait, and if the stranger came closer, she would deal with it then. Telling the truth now would only frighten people who had done nothing to deserve being dragged into her past. It was a decision that lasted exactly 4 days. The ranch in those first days after Sam's warning gave Eleanor little room to dwell on fear. There was too much work. Too many hands to feed, too many small crises that demanded her full attention before she could spare any of it for the dread sitting low in her stomach. On the second morning, one of the younger hands, a boy of maybe 17, named Robbie, came stumbling into the kitchen with his arm cradled against his chest and his face gone the color of old milk. "Ma'am, I don't want to trouble you." "Sit down," Eleanor said, already moving toward him. "What happened?" "Horse spooked. Threw me into the fence rail." He tried to smile through the pain and failed miserably. "I'll be fine. Just need to get back to work before Sam notices I'm—" "Sam already knows. He's the one who sent you in here." Eleanor took his arm gently and turned it, watching his face for the flinch that told her exactly where the damage was. "This needs to be set properly, or you'll carry a crooked arm for the rest of your life. Has anyone sent for the doctor?" "Doctor's 2 hours out, ma'am, and Caleb's off at the north pasture till evening." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Then I'll set it myself. My father broke his leg when I was 14, and I watched the doctor work on it twice, before he trusted me to change the splint on my own. She was already reaching for clean linen, a straight length of wood from the kindling pile, anything that might serve. "This is going to hurt, Robbie. I won't lie to you about that." "Yes, ma'am." It did hurt. Robbie's scream when she set the bone straight brought 3 ranch hands running from the yard boots, pounding across the porch, faces white with alarm until they saw Eleanor calmly wrapping the splint into place. Her voice low and steady, talking Robbie through his breathing like she'd done this 100 times before. "There," she said, finally tying off the last of the linen. "You'll keep that arm still for 6 weeks, and you'll thank me later instead of cursing me now." Robbie, sweating and pale but steadier, managed a weak laugh. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." When Caleb rode in that evening and found out what had happened, he went straight to the bunkhouse to check on Robbie himself, then came to find Eleanor in the kitchen, something unreadable working behind his eyes. "You set a man's arm today." "Someone had to. Doc Hensley rode out an hour ago to check your work, said he couldn't have done it cleaner himself." Caleb leaned against the doorframe, studying her the way he did sometimes, like he was trying to solve something he hadn't found the shape of yet. "Where'd a woman like you learn to set bones?" Eleanor kept her eyes on the stew she was stirring, unwilling to let him see how much the question unsettled her. "A woman like me learns whatever she needs to learn to survive, Mr. Walker." Caleb? She glanced up at him briefly. "My father was often injured in his work. I learned young how to manage it because there wasn't always a doctor nearby, and there wasn't always someone else willing to do it." It was true as far as it went. It simply wasn't the whole truth, and Eleanor was becoming uncomfortably aware of how much of her life she was learning to tell in careful half measures. Caleb didn't push. He never did, and that, more than anything, was what made the lying feel so much heavier than it should have. The stranger came back into town 2 days later. Eleanor heard about it from Martha, who'd gone into Silver Creek for supplies and returned with her mouth set in a thin, worried line. "Fella's still asking around," Martha said, setting a sack of flour down on the counter harder than necessary. "Ask the hotel clerk this time if any single woman had checked in recent matching a particular description." Clerk told him no such woman was staying there currently. She fixed Eleanor with a look that carried more weight than the words themselves. "Course that's true enough. You're not staying at the hotel anymore, are you?" Eleanor's hands went still over the bread dough she'd been kneading. "Martha, I'm not asking you to explain yourself," Martha said, softening slightly. "Lord knows everybody who comes through this territory is running from something. I've got my own reasons for ending up out here, same as anybody. But I'll tell you plain, Miss Whitmore, if there's trouble coming, it'd be a kindness to let Caleb know before it lands on his doorstep unannounced. That man's been through enough loss to last 3 lifetimes. He deserves fair warning if something's coming for the woman he brought under his roof." The words landed like a stone in Eleanor's chest. I don't know that it's anything to do with me at all." Martha's look told her exactly how much she believed that. "I'll think on it," Eleanor said quietly, and Martha, to her credit, let the matter drop, though the worry didn't leave her face for the rest of the afternoon. That night, Eleanor sat at the small writing desk in her room, a single candle burning low, and finally allowed herself to unlock the trunk at the bottom of the wardrobe. The false bottom came up easily under her fingers, worn smooth from the number of times she'd checked it during the long train ride west, needing to confirm again and again that the documents were still there, still safe, still exactly where she'd hidden them. She lifted the papers out carefully and spread them across the desk in the candlelight. Contracts, land deeds, letters between men who thought no one would ever read their private correspondence. Names she had memorized so thoroughly, she could recite them in her sleep, families who had lost land, lost homes, lost everything to a scheme so carefully constructed that most of the victims never even understood they'd been robbed. And at the center of it all, one name that appeared again and again across the documents, signed in a confident, arrogant hand that Eleanor had come to hate more than any other word in the English language: Richard Vale. She had worked for him once, or near enough. She had kept books for a shipping firm that did business with his land company, and it was there, buried in columns of figures that didn't quite balance that. She had first noticed something wrong. She had pulled the thread slowly, carefully over months, never quite believing what she was finding, until the evidence became too large to deny. Richard Vale had been forging land titles, buying up mortgages on properties belonging to families who couldn't read fine print, then manufacturing debts that didn't exist, foreclosing on land that should never have been in question, and reselling it at triple the value to wealthy buyers who never asked too many questions about where the deeds had come from. Dozens of families, maybe more. Eleanor had found 6 confirmed cases before she'd been forced to run, and she had no doubt there were dozens she'd never uncovered. She had gone to a lawyer first. A mistake, the lawyer had been on Vale's payroll, and within a week, Eleanor had received her first threat delivered by a man in an expensive coat who'd made it very clear what happened to people who threatened Richard Vale's business interests. She had gone to the authorities next. Another mistake. The sheriff in her home county owed Vale too many favors to care about the truth. By the time she understood there was nowhere safe to turn, she understood something else too, that Richard Vale would not simply let the matter drop. He would not rest until the documents were destroyed and the woman who'd found them was silenced one way or another, so she had run. She had answered Thomas Grayson's letters with a plan already forming in her mind. A new name, a new territory, a new life far enough from the east that Vale's reach might never find her. She had been wrong about that too, apparently. Because now there was a man in Silver Creek with city manners and city money, asking questions that fit her description far too closely to be coincidence. Eleanor sat there in the candlelight for a long time, staring at the evidence that had cost her everything, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. She would tell Caleb. Not everything. Not yet. She wasn't ready to hand him the full weight of what she was carrying, wasn't ready to see whatever look might cross his face when he learned the woman he'd brought into his home was being hunted by a man with money enough to buy silence from lawyers and lawmen alike. But she would tell him enough to warn him, enough to give him the choice of whether he still wanted her under his roof, now that danger might be following close behind. She just needed to find the courage to do it before the stranger found his way to Walker Ridge first. She didn't get the chance the next morning, or the morning after that. Life at the ranch, stubborn and demanding, kept intervening a broken fence line that needed mending. Before cattle wandered onto the Hendricks property. A sudden summer storm that flooded the low pasture and sent every hand scrambling to move the herd to higher ground. A batch of bread that burned black. Because Eleanor's attention had drifted somewhere it shouldn't have while Martha was laid up with a headache. And there were other moments too, smaller, quieter ones that made the idea of confession feel like it might shatter something fragile and good that had only just begun to take shape. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, Caleb found her on the porch after the hands had gone to bed, the way he'd taken to doing more often than either of them acknowledged out loud. "You've been distracted lately," he said, settling into the chair beside hers. "Have I burned the bread yesterday? You've never burned bread since you got here." He said it lightly, but there was something watchful underneath it. "Something on your mind." Eleanor's heart climbed into her throat. "Tell him. Now. This is the moment." "Just tired," she said, instead the words coming out before she could stop them. Martha's headache left more work than usual. Caleb studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he saw straight through the lie the way he seemed to see through most things she tried to hide from him. But he didn't push. "You work too hard," he said instead. "Nobody expects you to run yourself into the ground, Eleanor." Her name spoken plainly like that without formality did something strange to her chest every time he said it. She still hadn't grown used to it. "I don't know how to do anything halfway," she admitted. "Never have." "I noticed." A faint smile touched his mouth there and gone. "You've got the ledger so clean now, Sam says he barely recognizes the ranch's finances." Martha stopped complaining about the kitchen for the first time in a year. "Robbie won't stop telling anyone who'll listen how you set his arm better than the doctor could have." You're exaggerating. I'm not. He looked out over the darkening pasture, and something in his voice shifted, gone quieter, more careful. You've changed this place in 3 weeks, Eleanor. More than I expected. More than I think I was ready for, if I'm honest. The confession sat between them, fragile and unguarded, and Eleanor felt her own careful walls tremble at the weight of it. Ready for what? She asked softly. Caleb didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower, rougher at the edges. For the house to feel like something again, instead of just a place I sleep between one day's work and the next. I stopped expecting that a long time ago. Told myself I didn't want it anymore, easier that way. He glanced at her, something unguarded in his eyes that she'd never seen him allow before. Wasn't prepared for how fast that changed once you walked through the door. Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment the fear she'd been carrying Richard Vale, the stranger in town, the documents hidden in her trunk, receded just far enough to let something else in. Something warm and terrifying in equal measure. Caleb, You don't have to say anything, he said quickly, straightening slightly as though he'd surprised himself by saying as much as he had. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. Just wanted you to know the ranch is better for having you here, that's all. That's not all, Eleanor said quietly before she could stop herself. Caleb went still. No, he admitted. Guess it isn't. Guess it. They sat there in the dark, the space between their chairs feeling smaller than it had a moment ago, neither of them quite brave enough to close it entirely. Eleanor thought of the documents in her trunk, of the stranger, asking questions in town, of everything she still hadn't told him, and felt the confession rise in her throat again, insistent and terrified in equal measure. Tell him. Tell him now before this becomes something you can't afford to lose. There's something I need to tell you, she said, forcing the words out before her courage could fail her again. Caleb turned to look at her fully, something careful settling over his features. All right. It's about... The sound of hoofbeats coming hard up the ranch road cut through the quiet, fast and urgent, and both of them were on their feet before the rider even came into view. That's Danny, Caleb said, recognizing the horse before the rider. Something's wrong. The young hand pulled his horse up short in front of the porch, breathing hard, his face pale in the moonlight. Caleb, there's a fire. North pasture near the Hendricks line. Wind's picking up, and if it jumps the creek... Caleb was already moving, shouting orders toward the bunkhouse before Danny finished speaking, and Eleanor watched whatever moment had been building between them scatter into the urgent chaos of ranch hands scrambling for horses and shovels and wet sacking to beat back flames. Whatever confession either of them had been building toward would have to wait. The fire burned through most of the night, and by the time it was finally beaten back, Caleb and every hand on the ranch, working alongside neighbors, from 3 properties over, faces black with soot, hands blistered from the work. Dawn was already breaking pale and gray over the scorched edge of the north pasture. Eleanor had spent the night doing what she could from the house, boiling water for burns, tearing clean linen into bandages, keeping coffee hot for exhausted men who stumbled in and out through the small hours. When Caleb finally came through the door as the sun rose, he looked 10 years older than he had the evening before, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. Is everyone accounted for? Eleanor asked, already moving to help him out of his soot-blackened coat. Everyone's alive. A few burns, nothing serious. Lost maybe 40 acres of grazing land, but it could have been worse. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table, and Eleanor set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. Thank you. You should rest. In a minute. He wrapped both hands around the cup, but didn't drink, staring instead at the steam rising off the surface. You were about to tell me something last night, before Danny came riding in. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She'd hoped in the chaos of the night that he might have forgotten. Of course he hadn't. Caleb Walker didn't seem like a man who forgot much of anything. It can wait, she said. You need rest, not conversation. Eleanor? He looked up at her, and despite the exhaustion in his face, his eyes were sharp-focused entirely on her. Whatever it is, I'd rather hear it from you than find out some other way. That much I've learned the hard way more than once in my life. She hesitated the words she'd rehearsed the night before, scattering under the weight of his gaze. This wasn't the moment she'd imagined, not with him exhausted and burned and half a night without sleep behind him. But something in his voice told her he wouldn't let this go, not now that he'd caught the scent of it. "There's a man in town," she said finally, the words coming slow and careful. "Asking questions. About a woman matching my description who might have come through recently." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Who is he?" "I don't know. Not for certain. That much at least was true. But I have reason to believe he may be connected to trouble I left behind in the East." "What kind of trouble?" Eleanor's hands twisted together in her lap. "I can't explain all of it right now. It's complicated, and it isn't only my story to tell. There are other people involved who could be hurt if the wrong information reached the wrong ears." Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor braced herself for suspicion, for the questions she wasn't ready to answer, for the walls she'd feared might rise between them the moment he learned she was hiding something. Instead, he simply nodded, slow and steady. "All right. All right," she repeated, startled. "That's all you're going to say, for now." He finally drank some of the coffee, wincing slightly at the heat. "I've got no interest in dragging secrets out of a person who isn't ready to give them. Learned that lesson too, somewhere along the way." He met her eyes again. "But if there's danger coming, Eleanor, I need you to trust me enough to say so before it arrives, not after. That's not me demanding your secrets. That's me asking you to let me help protect this ranch and everyone on it, including you." The word "including" landed with unexpected weight, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "I will," she said quietly. "I promise." "Good." Caleb finished the coffee and stood, weariness pulling at every movement. "Now I need about 6 hours of sleep before I'm fit for anything else." "Go," Eleanor said. "I'll manage the house." He paused at the doorway, looking back at her with something unreadable in his expression. "Eleanor." "Yes. Whatever's chasing you, you're not facing it alone anymore. Wanted you to hear that plainly before I fall asleep standing up and forget to say it properly." He was gone before she could find a response, climbing the stairs with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man running on fumes. And Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen, her chest aching with something that felt dangerously close to the hope she'd been trying so hard to protect herself from. 3 days passed in relative quiet. The burned pasture was assessed, fences mended, the herd resettled onto unburned grazing land. Eleanor threw herself back into the rhythm of the household, and if she watched the road into the ranch a little more carefully than before, if her ears pricked at every unfamiliar hoofbeat in the distance, she told herself it was simple prudence, not fear. It was on the 4th day while she was in town, collecting supplies with Martha, that fear proved to be the wiser instinct. She saw him before he saw her. A man in a well-cut coat far too fine for the dust of Silver Creek's main street, standing outside the mercantile speaking with the owner in low, careful tones. Eleanor's whole body went cold the instant she recognized the particular arrogance in his posture, the way he held himself like a man accustomed to being obeyed. Not Richard Vale himself. She would have known Vale anywhere would have recognized that face, even after months of running. But this man carried himself with the same practiced confidence, the same expensive tailoring, the unmistakable air of someone sent to do a wealthy man's dirty work. "Martha," Eleanor said quietly, gripping her arm. "We need to leave. Now." Martha, sharp enough to read the fear in Eleanor's face, without needing further explanation, turned them both toward the wagon without a word of protest. But it was too late. The stranger's gaze swept across the street and caught on Eleanor's face, and she watched recognition dawn in his expression, slow and unmistakable, a predator's satisfaction settling over his features. "Miss Whitmore," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "I do believe I've finally found you." Eleanor's blood ran to ice. She didn't stop walking, didn't turn to acknowledge him, but her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Keep walking," Martha muttered under her breath. "Don't you dare stop." The man didn't follow immediately, perhaps unwilling to make a scene in the middle of a public street. Perhaps simply confident. He had all the time he needed now that he'd confirmed his quarry. But his voice followed her low and cold, carrying just far enough to reach her ears. Mr. Vale sends his regards. He's very eager to discuss the return of certain documents. I'll be in town a while longer, Miss Whitmore. I'm sure we'll have the chance to speak properly before long. Eleanor didn't stop moving until she and Martha had climbed into the wagon and put a good half-mile of road behind them, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins Martha eventually took from her without a word. "That's the man," Martha said finally once Silver Creek had shrunk small behind them. "The one been asking questions?" "Yes." "And this Vale he mentioned, that's the trouble you told Caleb about?" Eleanor nodded, unable to trust her voice. Martha was quiet for a long stretch of road, her weathered hands steady on the reins. Despite the tension, Eleanor could feel radiating off her. "You'd best tell Caleb the whole of it now," she finally said. "Not pieces, not what's comfortable, all of it. That man knows exactly where to find you, and pretending otherwise isn't going to keep this ranch safe." "I know," Eleanor whispered. "I know, Martha. I was going to. I just what?" Eleanor stared at the road ahead, the mountains rising blue and distant against the afternoon sky. "I was afraid of what he'd think of me, once he knew everything." Martha's expression softened just slightly. "Child, that man pulled you off a dark road with nothing but a suitcase and gave you a home without asking a single question about your past. You really think the truth is going to change how he sees you now?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "That's exactly what frightens me." "Guy." She found Caleb in the barn that evening, working on a length of fence rail by lantern light, and the moment he looked up and saw her face, he set down his tools without a word and crossed the space between them. "What happened?" "He found me." Eleanor said the words tumbling out faster than she'd planned, all her careful rehearsal abandoned in the face of his steady waiting eyes. "The man in town. He knew my name. He said Richard Vale sends his regards and that he wants documents back, and he said he'd have the chance to speak with me properly before long. And Caleb, I should have told you everything from the start. I'm so sorry. Eleanor." Caleb's voice was calm, steady, cutting gently through her spiral. "Breathe. Then tell me everything. From the beginning." So she did. She told him about the shipping firm, about the columns of figures that didn't balance, about the months she'd spent quietly pulling threads, until she understood the full shape of what Richard Vale had built, a scheme of forged land titles and manufactured debts that had stolen homes and property from families too poor or too trusting to fight back. She told him about the lawyer on Vale's payroll, the sheriff who owed too many favors, the threats that had escalated from careful warnings to something far more dangerous. She told him about the documents hidden in the false bottom of her trunk, proof enough to bring the entire scheme crashing down if it ever reached the right hands. And she told him finally the truth about Thomas Grayson's letters, how she had answered them already planning her escape, needing a destination far enough from Vale's reach to buy herself time to figure out what came next, never imagining that the man himself would abandon her before she even arrived. "So he was real," Caleb said slowly when she finally fell silent. "Grayson, this wasn't some plot connected to Vale. No. As far as I know, he was simply a coward who changed his mind about marrying a stranger. The timing was nothing but terrible coincidence." Eleanor's voice cracked on the last words, all the fear and exhaustion of the day finally breaking through the composure she'd fought so hard to maintain. "I should have told you all of this the night you found me. I let you bring a stranger under your roof without any idea of the danger that might follow her." Caleb was quiet for the long moment, studying her face in the lantern light, and Eleanor braced herself for whatever judgment might follow. "You didn't lie to me," he said finally. "You just didn't tell me everything yet. There's a difference, and I think you know that better than most, given what you must have learned about trust before you ever set foot in this territory. You're not angry. I didn't say that." His jaw tightened slightly. "I'm angry, Eleanor, just not at you. I'm angry at a man wealthy enough to steal land from people who can't fight back, and confident enough to send someone into my town looking for a woman brave enough to try and stop him." He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his gaze. "You should have told me. But I understand why you didn't, and I'm not going to waste time punishing you for a decision I might have made myself in your position." Eleanor felt something in her chest crack open entirely, the last of her careful defenses giving way. "You barely know me, Caleb. Why does any of this matter so much to you? Because you walked into this ranch carrying more weight than any person should have to carry alone." Caleb said, his voice rough now, unguarded in a way she'd never heard from him before. "And somewhere in the last 3 weeks, without either one of us planning on it, I stopped thinking of you as someone I found on a road and started thinking of you as someone I don't much like the idea of losing." The words hung between them, raw and unrehearsed, and Eleanor felt her breath catch entirely. "Caleb?" "That man in town," Caleb continued before she could find words of her own. "He's not getting anywhere near you. Not while there's breath in me to stop it. That's not a promise I'm making lightly, Eleanor. That's a fact. He works for a dangerous man. Richard Vale has money enough to buy sheriff's lawyers' entire towns if he needs to. You don't know what you're offering to stand against. Maybe not." Caleb's expression didn't waver. "But I know what it looks like when someone's spent their whole life being left to fend for themselves by people who should have protected them. And I'll be damned if I add my name to that list." Eleanor didn't have words for what rose in her chest. Then something too large and too frightening to name something that felt dangerously close to everything she'd promised herself she would never risk again after Thomas Grayson's letter had taught her exactly how much it cost to trust a stranger's promises. But Caleb Walker was not a stranger anymore. And whatever this was building between them in the lantern light of a barn on the edge of Montana territory felt nothing like the careful, distant promises that had brought her west in the first place. It felt real. It felt terrifying. And despite everything, despite Richard Vale, despite the stranger in town, despite every reason she had to keep running, Eleanor found she didn't want to run from this. The following days brought no further sign of Vale's man, though the quiet did little to ease the tension that had settled over Walker Ridge. Caleb doubled the watch on the ranch's boundaries. Sam Dawson took to carrying a rifle, even on routine rides. Martha kept the household running with a wary eye toward the road, and Eleanor found herself unable to fully relax into the rhythm of ranch life that had felt only a week earlier like the beginning of something safe. But there were good moments too stolen in between the watchfulness moments that felt like small acts of defiance against the fear hanging over everything. One evening after the hands had eaten and the kitchen had finally quieted, Caleb appeared in the doorway with something unfamiliar in his hands. A battered fiddle, its wood worn smooth from years of handling. "Didn't know you played?" Eleanor said, surprised. "Don't much, not since Sarah passed." He said his late wife's name plainly without flinching, though something careful crossed his face. "She used to make me play for her on evenings like this. Told her I had no talent for it. She never believed me." "Play for me then," Eleanor said before she could think better of it. "I'd like to hear." Caleb hesitated, then settled into the chair across from her and lifted the fiddle to his shoulder. What followed was rough, unpracticed, occasionally missing a note entirely. But there was something in it, some careful tenderness in the way he coaxed the melody out, after years of silence, that made Eleanor's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with fear. When he finished, he set the fiddle down, looking almost embarrassed. "Told you, no talent." "I thought it was beautiful," Eleanor said honestly. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude, or something else entirely that he didn't quite have words for. "Been a long time since anyone in this house asked to hear it." "Then I'm glad I asked." They sat there a while longer, the fiddle silent between them. Now the kitchen warm with lamplight, and Eleanor allowed herself just for a moment to imagine a life where Richard Vale had never existed, where the only thing waiting for her in Montana was this quiet evenings. Careful trust, a man slowly relearning how to let someone close after years of guarding himself against exactly that. It was a dangerous thing to imagine. She knew that, even as she let herself do it, because somewhere out there, a man with city manners and city money was still waiting, still watching, still carrying a message from Richard Vale that Eleanor knew with sick certainty was far from finished. The confirmation came 8 days later, delivered not by a stranger in town, but by a letter left tucked beneath the front door of the ranch house sometime in the night, discovered by Martha when she rose before dawn to start the morning fires. Eleanor's hands shook as she broke the seal, Caleb standing close beside her, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. The letter was brief. Elegant handwriting, the same confident hand she recognized from the documents in her trunk. Miss Whitmore, it has come to my attention that you have found yourself a new protector in Mr. Walker of Silver Creek. How touching. I do hope he understands the nature of the woman he has taken under his roof, a thief in possession of documents stolen from my private business affairs, spreading dangerous falsehoods that could ruin the reputations of good men who have done nothing but conduct honest business. I would prefer to resolve this matter quietly. Return what belongs to me, and this unpleasantness can end without further complication for anyone, including Mr. Walker, whose ranch, I understand, sits on land with a mortgage that could prove vulnerable should certain financial pressures be applied. You have 1 week to reconsider your position. I would advise using it wisely. R.V. Eleanor's breath left her in a rush, the paper trembling in her grip. He's threatening the ranch. Caleb, he knows about your mortgage. He's threatening to... I read it. Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. The anger in it banked low and controlled in a way that frightened Eleanor more than shouting would have. Let him try. You don't understand what he's capable of. He's ruined men far more powerful than you, Caleb. He has money and connections that reach into places you can't even... Eleanor. Caleb took the letter from her trembling hands and set it down on the table, then took both of her hands in his, steady and warm, despite the fury still simmering beneath his calm exterior. I understand exactly what kind of man threatens a woman through the ranch of the man protecting her, instead of facing either one of us directly. That's not power, Eleanor. That's cowardice with money behind it. He'll come here himself eventually, or send someone worse than the man in town. Then we'll be ready. Caleb's grip tightened around her hands. You are not facing this alone. Not now. Not when he shows his face. Not ever. Whatever it costs, whatever risk it brings to this ranch, I meant what I said in that barn, Eleanor. You're not on that list of people who left you to fend for yourself. I won't be. Eleanor searched his face for any hint of hesitation, any flicker of doubt that might suggest he was saying what he thought she needed to hear, rather than what he truly believed. She found none. Only the same steady resolve she'd seen in him from the very first night, standing on a dark road, with nothing to offer her but honesty and a chance. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you risk everything you've built for a woman you've known less than a month? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing an absent, gentle line across the back of her hand. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped low, rough, with something he seemed to be admitting to himself as much as to her. Because somewhere in this past month, Eleanor Whitmore, you stopped being a woman I found on a road and became someone I can't imagine this ranch without. That's not the kind of thing I'm willing to let a man like Richard Vale take away from me. Not without a fight. The confession settled over Eleanor like warmth spreading through a body that had been cold for far too long, and for one suspended moment, the fear of Vale's letter receded just far enough to let something else take its place, something fragile and terrifying and more real than anything Thomas Grayson's careful, distant letters had ever offered her. I'm frightened, she admitted. Not just for myself, for you, for everyone here. I know. Caleb lifted her hand and pressed his lips gently against her knuckles, a gesture so unexpected and so tender that Eleanor felt her breath catch entirely. But we'll face it together. Whatever comes next, you won't be standing alone on some empty platform wondering if anyone's coming for you. I already came, Eleanor, and I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the morning light was breaking gray and uncertain over the ranch, 1 week now standing between them and whatever Richard Vale intended to do next. But for the first time since she'd read his threatening letter, Eleanor found she could breathe past the fear enough to feel something else beneath it. Not safety, not yet. Richard Vale was still out there, still dangerous, still counting down a week that would end however it ended. But she was no longer facing it from an empty platform, with nothing but a suitcase and a folded letter for company. She was facing it from Walker Ridge, with a man beside her who had promised in the quiet dark of a ranch kitchen that he intended to keep his word. And somewhere beneath the fear, Eleanor Whitmore allowed herself to believe for the first time in longer than she could remember that this promise might actually be one worth trusting. The week Richard Vale had given her stretched out ahead of Eleanor like a held breath. She woke each morning counting it down without meaning to. 6 days. 5 days. The number sat behind every task she completed, every meal she prepared, every ledger entry she made, with hands that had learned over the past month not to shake until now. Caleb doubled the watch again. 2 hands rotated through the night rifles resting across their laps on the porch, and by the 3rd day, even Martha had taken to keeping a loaded shotgun propped by the kitchen door. Though she never spoke of it directly, simply moved it into place, the way she might move a broom. "You don't have to pretend this is normal," Eleanor told her, finding her checking the load one afternoon. "Wasn't pretending anything," Martha said. "Just making sure if trouble comes calling, it gets a proper greeting." She set the shotgun back against the wall. "You look tired, child. You're not sleeping." "I'm managing." "That's not what I asked." Eleanor didn't answer because the truth was too complicated to say out loud, that she lay awake most nights replaying Richard Vale's letter word for word, turning his threats over like stones, searching for some angle she hadn't yet considered. A mortgage that could prove vulnerable. She didn't know exactly what Vale meant by it, but she knew enough about the man to understand he wouldn't have written the words without already having some plan in motion. She said as much to Caleb that evening, finding him in the small office off the kitchen, where he kept the ranch's paperwork, a lamp burning low over a stack of documents he'd been studying with a furrowed brow. "What are you looking at?" "Mortgage papers." Caleb didn't look up. Wanted to know exactly what kind of leverage a man like Vale could actually pull if he tried. Eleanor's stomach tightened. "And bank holding my note is out of Helena. Small operation run by a man named Whitfield, who's held half the mortgages in this territory for 20 years. Doesn't strike me as the kind of man who'd bend easy to pressure from some stranger back east, whatever money he's carrying." Caleb finally looked up, and there was something steady in his expression that eased just slightly the knot in her chest. "But I wrote to him anyway. Wanted him to hear the situation from me before anybody tried telling him a different version. You didn't have to do that." "I did, actually." He set the papers aside. "A man in Vale's position doesn't threaten idly, Eleanor. If he's willing to put something like that in writing, he's already looking for the fastest way to make good on it. Better Whitfield hears the truth from me now than lies from Vale's man later." It was, Eleanor thought, exactly the kind of practical, unglamorous courage she was coming to understand as fundamentally Caleb, not grand gestures, not dramatic declarations, but the quiet, deliberate work of closing every door Vale might try to use against them. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me yet." Caleb's jaw tightened. We've got 5 days left on his clock, and I doubt very much he intends to simply walk away if we ignore his letter. He was right, of course. Eleanor had known it from the moment she'd read Vale's careful, elegant threats. Men like Richard Vale did not make idle promises, and they did not accept silence as an answer. The stranger returned to town on the 4th day, and this time he didn't wait for Eleanor to come to him. Sam Dawson brought the news back to the ranch at a dead gallop, his horse lathered with sweat, his face grim, in a way that made Eleanor's blood run cold, before he'd even said a word. "He's asking for you by name now," Sam said, swinging down from his horse before it had fully stopped. "Told the sheriff he's got legal business with a Miss Eleanor Whitmore currently residing at Walker Ridge. Sheriff Coburn's asking questions, Caleb. Wants to know what kind of legal business a stranger's got with a woman working your household." Caleb's expression darkened. "Coburn ask anything else? Asked if it was true you'd taken in a woman with no clear account of where she came from." Man's fishing Caleb. Trying to make it sound like there's something improper going on here, something the law ought to look into. Sam glanced toward Eleanor, apologetic. "Didn't mean nothing by repeating it, ma'am. Just figured you both needed to know what's being said in town." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her, a new and uglier fear crawling up her spine. It wasn't only Vale's threat of financial ruin she needed to worry about now. It was reputation, the same brutal currency that had already cost her a home once before, in a life she'd crossed a country trying to leave behind. "He's trying to turn the town against us," she said quietly. "If Sheriff Coburn starts asking questions about my character, about why I left the East, it won't matter whether any of it's true. People will believe whatever sounds most convenient." "Coburn's a reasonable man," Caleb said, though there was tension in the words that suggested even he wasn't entirely certain of that. "He won't act on rumor alone. You don't know that. And even if he doesn't act, the whispering alone could be enough. Vale doesn't need to prove anything, Caleb. He only needs to make people doubt." Eleanor's hands curled into fists at her sides. "That's exactly how he operates. I watched him do it to a family in Pennsylvania who tried to fight one of his forged deeds. Within a month, the whole county believed they were the ones who'd committed fraud, not him." Caleb's jaw worked, and for a moment, Eleanor watched him wrestle visibly with something anger she thought, though whether it was directed at Vale or at his own uncertainty about how to fight a threat this slippery, she couldn't quite tell. "Then we go to Coburn ourselves," he said finally, "before Vale's man gets another word in. We tell him the truth, all of it, the documents, the scheme, everything you've been carrying. Better he hears it from us clear and complete than gets it filtered through whatever story Vale's paying that man to spread. And if he doesn't believe us, if he sides with a wealthy stranger over a ranch owner and a woman with no proof beyond her own word—" "I have proof?" Eleanor said slowly, an idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. "The documents. If I show Coburn the actual evidence, the forged deeds, the manufactured debts, Vale's own signature on records he never intended anyone outside his circle to see, that's not rumor. That's proof a sheriff can't simply dismiss." Caleb looked at her, something like relief and admiration crossing his face in equal measure. "Are you ready to do that? Once those documents are out of that trunk and in front of the law, there's no putting them back. Vale will know exactly where you stand, and he won't have any more patience left for quiet threats." Eleanor thought of the platform in Silver Creek, of the letter that had ended her engagement before it began, of every door that had closed in her face during those first desperate days in town. She thought of the 6 families whose stolen homes she carried proof of in that trunk. Families who had no voice loud enough to be heard against a man like Vale. She thought of Caleb standing beside her in the barn, promising she wouldn't face this alone. "I'm ready," she said, and found to her own surprise that she meant it completely. Sheriff Coburn's office sat at the far end of Silver Creek's main street, a squat brick building that looked entirely too modest to hold the weight of what Eleanor was about to bring through its door. Coburn himself was an older man, gray at the temples, with the tired, watchful eyes of someone who'd spent decades sorting truth from the countless lies that passed through a frontier sheriff's office. He looked up when Caleb and Eleanor entered, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that told Eleanor he'd already heard plenty about her before this moment. "Walker. Miss Whitmore, I presume?" His eyes flicked between them. "Understand there's been some interest in your comings and goings, miss. Fella in town's been asking a lot of questions." "That's exactly why we're here," Caleb said before Eleanor could speak. "Man's spreading lies about Miss Whitmore, and we intend to set the record straight before those lies do any damage." Coburn leaned back in his chair, gesturing for them to sit. "All right then, let's hear it." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened the leather satchel she'd carried in from the wagon. But her voice, when she began to speak, came out steadier than she expected. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I came to Silver Creek from Pennsylvania, believing I was traveling to marry a man named Thomas Grayson. That engagement fell through the moment I arrived, a private matter unrelated to anything I'm about to tell you." She met Coburn's steady gaze directly. "Before I left Pennsylvania, I discovered evidence of a large-scale land fraud scheme orchestrated by a wealthy businessman named Richard Vale. I have documentation proving he forged land titles, manufactured false debts against families who couldn't defend themselves, and illegally foreclosed on properties he then resold at enormous profit. She began laying the documents out across Coburn's desk one by one, watching his expression shift from polite skepticism to something far more serious as he studied the forged signatures, the falsified records, the pattern of theft that spanned 6 confirmed families, and Eleanor suspected many more she'd never had the chance to uncover. This is... Coburn picked up one of the deeds, studying it closely. This is Vale's own hand on this. You're certain of the authenticity? Entirely. I kept books for a firm that did business with his land company. I found these discrepancies myself over months of careful review. I have no reason to fabricate any of it, Sheriff, and every reason to fear the consequences of having found it at all. Which is why she ran, Caleb added. Vale threatened her life once she confronted the truth. That's why she came west. Not for some grand adventure, but because staying in Pennsylvania meant staying somewhere Vale could reach her. Coburn set the deed down carefully and looked up at Eleanor with an expression she hadn't expected. Not doubt, but something closer to grim understanding. I've heard whispers of men like this before. Never had proof this solid land on my desk, though. He leaned forward. This man asking after you in town. He worked for Vale directly. I believe so, yes. He mentioned Vale by name when he approached me. And Vale himself. He's threatened you directly. Eleanor pulled the letter from her satchel, the one that had arrived beneath the ranch's front door, and set it on the desk alongside the documents. Coburn read it slowly, his expression darkening with each line. This mentions your mortgage Walker, he said, looking up at Caleb. Threatens to apply financial pressure through your bank. I've already written to Whitfield and Helena. Wanted the truth ahead of whatever lies Vale's man might try to spread. Coburn nodded slowly, then sat back in his chair, studying both of them for a long moment. This is a serious matter. More serious than I expected when Danvers first came around asking his questions. He tapped the stack of documents. I'll need to hold on to these. Send word to the territorial marshal's office, maybe reach out to authorities back in Pennsylvania to verify the claims against these families directly. This kind of case, it needs to go through proper channels if you want it to actually stick against a man with Vale's resources. How long will that take? Eleanor asked, unable to keep the anxiety from her voice. Weeks, most likely. Could be longer, depending on how fast word travels and how cooperative the authorities back east prove to be. Coburn's expression turned careful. In the meantime, Miss Whitmore, I'd advise caution. A man desperate enough to threaten a rancher's mortgage over stolen documents isn't likely to simply wait patiently while the law sorts through paperwork. The warning settled over Eleanor, like a physical weight, echoing everything she'd already feared since Vale's letter arrived. Proof was one thing. Proof moving through the slow machinery of frontier law was quite another, and she had no illusions about how much time that machinery might buy her before Vale grew tired of waiting. Thank you, Sheriff, Caleb said, standing. We appreciate you taking this seriously. Wish I could do more faster, Coburn admitted, gathering the documents carefully into a locked drawer. But I'll get word out today, and Walker. His eyes flicked to Eleanor, something almost protective in his expression. Keep a close watch on that ranch. Man like Vale backed into a corner with proof this damning against him tends to get more dangerous, not less. Nay. The warning proved prophetic faster than any of them expected. 2 days later, 3 days now, standing between them and the end of Vale's original deadline, Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices in the yard, sharp and urgent enough to send her scrambling from bed before she'd even fully processed what she was hearing. By the time she reached the porch, half-dressed and breathless, she found Caleb standing rigid in the yard, facing a man she didn't recognize. Not the stranger from town, but someone new. Older, with the weathered look of a man who did dangerous work for a living, and had long since stopped being troubled by it. Final warning. Walker, the man was saying, his voice carrying the flat, unbothered tone of someone delivering a message he'd delivered many times before. Mr. Vale's patience has limits. You'd do well not to test them further. Get off my land, Caleb said, his voice dangerously calm in a way Eleanor had never heard from him. The man's eyes flickered toward the porch, catching sight of Eleanor, and something cold and assessing crossed his expression. Miss Whitmore, Mr. Vale wanted me to convey something directly to you since it seems the written word hasn't proven persuasive enough. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she made herself walk forward, refusing to let fear keep her hidden behind Caleb like something needing protection. Then say it. Sheriff's office in town received some interesting documents 2 days back. Mr. Vale is aware. The man's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. He wanted you to know that actions have consequences, Miss Whitmore. Consequences that extend beyond yourself. Is that a threat? Caleb's voice had gone sharp enough to cut. It's an observation. The man's eyes didn't leave Eleanor's face. Mr. Vale has considerable reach even out here in the territory. Bankers, judges, men who owe him favors in places you wouldn't expect. He wanted you both to understand exactly what kind of fight you've chosen before it goes any further. We understand perfectly, Eleanor said, forcing steel into her voice, despite the fear churning in her stomach. We understand that Richard Vale is a coward who steals land from families who can't defend themselves and then hides behind hired men when the truth finally catches up to him. You can tell him I have no intention of backing down no matter how many threats he sends. Something flickered across the man's face. Surprise maybe at her defiance before it smoothed back into careful neutrality. I'll deliver the message. He turned back toward his horse, then paused, looking back at Caleb. For what it's worth, Walker, I'd think carefully about which fights are worth losing everything over. Mr. Vale doesn't make promises he doesn't intend to keep. Neither do I, Caleb said flatly. Now get off my land before I have Sam here escort you off it with something less polite than words. The man mounted his horse without further comment and rode off down the ranch road, and Eleanor watched him go with her heart still hammering against her ribs, the weight of Vale's reach settling over her like a physical thing. He knows about the sheriff, she said quietly once the rider had disappeared from sight. He knows we've already gone to the law, which means he's got someone watching this ranch, or someone in town feeding him information. Caleb's jaw tightened. Sam Dawson emerged from the bunkhouse, already half-dressed, rifle in hand, clearly roused by the commotion. Heard most of that. I want eyes on the road day and night starting now. Nobody comes onto this property without us knowing about it first. Caleb turned back to Eleanor, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw genuine fear behind his controlled exterior. Not fear for himself, she realized, but fear for her. This is escalating faster than I expected. He's frightened, Eleanor said slowly, working through the logic even as the words left her mouth. A man like Vale doesn't send hired muscle to make personal threats unless he's genuinely worried about what those documents could do to him. The proof I gave the sheriff, it's real leverage, Caleb. That's exactly why he's pushing this hard this fast. That's supposed to reassure me. It should. A frightened man makes mistakes. He's shown his hand faster than he intended to, which means he's more desperate than he wants us to believe. Eleanor felt something steady settling into her chest, despite the fear. Not confidence exactly, but resolve, the same stubborn resolve that had carried her through months of careful investigation back in Pennsylvania before she'd ever had to run. We just need to survive long enough for the law to catch up to him. Survival over the following days became a delicate and exhausting balance. Caleb kept the watch doubled, then tripled, when a second unfamiliar rider was spotted circling the ranch's outer boundary, 2 nights later gone, before Sam could catch more than a glimpse of him in the dark. Eleanor barely slept, her mind cycling endlessly between fear for the ranch, fear for Caleb, and a slow-burning fury at Richard Vale that she found increasingly outweighing the fear entirely. It was during this stretch of anxious waiting that Martha found her one evening sitting alone in the kitchen, long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at nothing in particular. "You're not sleeping again," Martha observed, settling into the chair across from her without asking permission. "I keep thinking about those families," Eleanor admitted. The ones Vale stole from. I have their names memorized, Martha. The Hendersons in Lancaster County. The Millers outside Harrisburg. 4 others besides them. They lost everything, their homes, their land, generations of work, because one man decided their lives were worth less than his profit. And you think stopping him is worth risking your own life? Worth risking Caleb's ranch and Sam's safety and mine? Eleanor looked up, searching Martha's face for judgment, and finding instead something gentler. Do you think I'm wrong to fight this? I think, Martha said slowly, that I've known a lot of folks in my life who ran from trouble their whole lives, and I've known a few who finally stood and fought it. The ones who fought, they didn't always win easy, but not a single one of them regretted standing even when it cost them plenty. She reached across the table and covered Eleanor's hand with her own, weathered and warm. You're not wrong, child. You're just scared, same as anybody would be, facing a man with Vale's kind of money and meanness. What if it costs Caleb the ranch? What if it costs him more than that? Then that'll be his choice to make, same as it's yours. Martha's expression turned firm. But I've watched that man since his wife passed, watched him build walls so high, I thought he'd never let another living soul close enough to matter again. You did that, Eleanor. Whatever else comes of this fight with Vale, you already gave Caleb Walker something he'd given up on ever having again. Don't you dare shrink that down to nothing just because you're afraid of the cost. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. I care for him. More than I ever expected to this fast. I know. I'm terrified of what happens if this goes wrong. If Vale hurts him because of me. Then you fight harder to make sure it doesn't, Martha said simply. That's all any of us can do facing down men like Vale. Fight harder, stand closer together, and refuse to let fear make the choice for you. The break came unexpectedly on the 6th day, not from Vale's direction, but from Sheriff Coburn, who rode out to the ranch himself with news that changed the shape of everything. Got a response from the territorial marshal, he said, settling heavily into a chair at the kitchen table, while Eleanor poured coffee with hands that had finally mercifully stopped shaking quite so badly. And a wire back from authorities in Pennsylvania confirming 2 of the families you named, the Hendersons and the Millers, both lost their land to foreclosures that match exactly what you described. Forged debts, falsified signatures, the whole scheme. They confirmed it, Eleanor breathed. Officially. Officially enough that the marshal's office is taking this seriously now. They're sending an investigator out from the territorial capital, should arrive within the week. Vale's reach might extend into local banks and lawyers, but it doesn't extend as far into federal territorial authority, not yet at least. Coburn's expression turned grim. But I'll tell you plainly, Miss Whitmore, a man like Vale backed into a real corner by real federal attention. That's exactly the kind of situation that makes him most dangerous. He knows the walls are closing. Desperate men do desperate things. How desperate? Caleb asked, his voice tight. Desperate enough that I'd advise extra caution over the next several days. If Vale believes this investigation is about to end his freedom, he may decide direct action against the 2 of you is worth the risk, rather than let this play out through proper channels. Eleanor's stomach twisted with a new, sharper fear. You think he'd come here himself? I think a cornered animal doesn't always run the direction you expect it to, Coburn said carefully. I'll increase patrols near the ranch as best I can, but Silver Creek's a small operation, Miss Whitmore. I can't promise round-the-clock protection. We don't need it, Caleb said, his jaw set with grim determination. We'll manage our own defense. Just make sure that investigator gets here as fast as possible. Coburn nodded and rose to leave, pausing at the doorway to look back at Eleanor with something that might have been respect. For what it's worth, Miss takes considerable courage to stand against a man with Vale's kind of money and reach. Whatever happens from here, that courage is going to matter. Might be the thing that finally brings men like him to account. That night, with Coburn's warning still hanging heavy over the ranch, Eleanor found herself unable to settle, pacing the small confines of her room until she finally gave up on sleep entirely and made her way downstairs, drawn by the faint light still burning in Caleb's office. She found him exactly where she expected, bent over papers at his desk, though she suspected from the tension in his shoulders that he wasn't reading them so much as staring through them. "You should be resting," she said softly, echoing the words he'd said to her weeks before. Caleb looked up, something weary and unguarded in his expression that he usually kept carefully hidden. "Can't. Keep running through everything," Coburn said. "Desperate men doing desperate things." He set down the papers. "Can't stop thinking about what that means for you specifically. You're the one he wants silenced, Eleanor. If he decides to act directly, then we face it together," Eleanor said, crossing the room to stand beside his desk. "The way you promised that night in the barn." "I meant that promise." Caleb stood close enough now that she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the fear he'd been carefully hiding from everyone but himself. "But meaning a promise and being able to guarantee I can keep it. Those aren't the same thing. If something happened to you because of a fight, I encouraged you to keep fighting." "You didn't encourage anything," Eleanor said firmly. "I chose this fight long before I ever met you, Caleb. The moment I found those forged deeds, the moment I understood what Vale had done to those families, I chose to be someone who couldn't simply look away and pretend I hadn't seen it. That choice was mine. Everything since then has just been the consequence of staying true to it." And if the consequence cost you your life? The question hung between them, raw and unguarded, and Eleanor found herself reaching for his hand without fully deciding to needing the contact, needing to ground herself in something solid against the fear that had been building steadily for days. "Then at least it will have cost me something worth the price," she said quietly. "I spent years, Caleb, being someone who stayed quiet, who let powerful men decide what happened to people who couldn't fight back because fighting back felt too dangerous, too costly. I'm done being that person. Whatever Vale does next, I'd rather face it standing than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd simply run again." Caleb's hand tightened around hers, and something in his expression shifted, the careful control finally cracking to reveal the full depth of what he'd been holding back since the moment that stranger had ridden onto his land making threats. "I can't lose you." He said the words rough and unrehearsed, stripped of every careful boundary he'd maintained since the night he'd found her on that road. "I know it hasn't been long. I know this isn't how any of this is supposed to happen, falling for a woman I found wandering alone in the dark less than 2 months ago. But I can't pretend anymore that this is simple gratitude or simple duty or whatever careful word I've been using to keep myself from admitting the truth." Eleanor's breath caught entirely, her heart hammering against her ribs for reasons that had nothing to do with fear of Richard Vale. "What's the truth?" she whispered. "The truth is, I love you." Caleb said the words falling out plain and unguarded, exactly the way he said everything that mattered most. "Started somewhere around the 3rd night watching you set Robbie's arm without flinching. And it's only gotten worse or better, I suppose, depending how you look at it, every single day since. I love you, Eleanor Whitmore, and the idea of losing you to a man like Vale terrifies me more than anything has since the day I buried my wife." Eleanor felt tears spill over before she could stop them, months of careful defenses finally giving way entirely beneath the weight of a confession she hadn't dared hope for. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and like the truest thing she'd said in years. "I've been afraid to say it, afraid that admitting it would make losing you, losing this hurt, even worse than it already would. But I can't keep pretending otherwise, not after everything we've faced together these past weeks." Caleb's hand came up to cup her face, gentle and reverent, and for a moment the fear of Vale, the threats, the danger circling closer with every passing day, all of it receded, leaving only the two of them standing in the lamplit quiet of his office, finally speaking aloud what had been building since that first night on the dark road. "Whatever comes next," Caleb said softly, "we face it as exactly this, together. No more careful distance, no more pretending this is simple circumstance." His thumb traced gently along her cheekbone. "I meant it when I said you're not facing this alone, Eleanor. I meant it more than I think I even understood when I first said it." Eleanor leaned into his touch, allowing herself finally to feel the full weight of everything she'd been fighting to hold back, the fear, yes, but also the fierce, unexpected joy of being loved by a man who had proven again and again that his promises meant exactly what he said they meant. "Then let him come," she said quietly. "Whatever Vale sends next, whatever desperate move Coburn warned us about, let him come. I'd rather face it standing beside you than spend one more day running from a fear that's already cost me enough of my life." Caleb's forehead dropped to rest against hers, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke at all, simply breathing together in the quiet dark, gathering whatever strength they could from the fragile, hard-won certainty of loving and being loved in return. Outside, somewhere beyond the boundaries of Walker Ridge, Richard Vale's next move was already taking shape, a desperate man's final gambit against the proof that threatened to end everything he'd built on stolen land and broken lives. But inside that small lamplit office, Eleanor Whitmore held onto the one truth Vale's money and threats had never managed to touch. She was no longer standing alone on an empty platform, wondering if anyone would ever come for her. Someone had come. And whatever price the fight against Richard Vale demanded next, she intended to meet it with Caleb Walker, standing exactly where he'd promised he would be, right beside her, unwavering, until the very end. The investigator from the territorial capital was supposed to arrive within the week. He arrived instead in 9 days, and when he finally rode onto Walker Ridge, Eleanor understood immediately that something had gone wrong before he'd even dismounted. His name was Agent Foster, a lean man with tired eyes and a coat dusted from hard travel, and the first thing he said before introductions, before pleasantries was, "I need to speak with you both privately, now if possible." Caleb led him into the office, and Eleanor followed, her stomach already tightening with dread. "There's been a complication," Foster said once the door was closed. "I stopped in Silver Creek before riding out here. Wanted to get a feel for the town, see what people were saying before I spoke with you directly." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Miss Whitmore, are you aware there's a story circulating that you're wanted for theft back in Pennsylvania? That you stole those very documents you handed Sheriff Coburn, along with a considerable sum of money from your former employer?" Eleanor's blood went cold. "That's a lie, a complete fabrication." "I suspected as much," Foster said. "But it's a well-constructed lie, Miss Whitmore. Detailed. Specific dates, specific amounts, even a supposed warrant number that when I wired to confirm turned out not to exist in any Pennsylvania court record." He set the paper down on Caleb's desk. "Someone with real resources manufactured this, and they've spent the last several days making sure half of Silver Creek believes it." "Vale," Caleb said, his voice flat with fury, "almost certainly. This is exactly the kind of countermeasure a man in his position would deploy once he understood federal attention was closing in. Discredit the witness before her testimony can matter." Foster's expression was grim. "I won't lie to either of you. This complicates things considerably. A territorial judge is far less likely to weigh testimony from someone the town believes is a fugitive thief." Eleanor sat down heavily in the chair across from the desk, the ground she'd fought so hard to stand on, suddenly feeling far less solid than it had a week ago. "Then he's already won. Whatever proof I have, whatever those families back east can confirm, none of it matters if no one believes a word I say." "That's not entirely true," Foster said. "The documents themselves don't lie regardless of what people believe about the woman who found them. Handwriting analysis, verification against county records back in Pennsylvania, testimony from the Henderson and Miller families, all of that stands independent of whatever character assassination Vale's arranged in town. It simply means we'll need to move more carefully and faster before this rumor calcifies into something harder to undo." "How much faster?" "I'd like to have you both in front of the territorial judge within 2 weeks. Judge Ashford holds circuit court in Bozeman, and I can arrange for the hearing to be expedited, given the federal interest in Vale's activities." "But Miss Whitmore," Foster's gaze turned careful. "You should prepare yourself. Vale's lawyer will use every version of that fabricated story he can construct. He'll attack your character, your reasons for leaving Pennsylvania, anything he can find to make the judge doubt your word before the documents even come into evidence." Eleanor thought of Thomas Grayson's letter, of the humiliation of that empty platform, and felt a fresh wave of dread settle over her. If Vale's lawyer dug deep enough, he wouldn't even need to fabricate everything. The bones of her story, a broken engagement, a woman arriving in Montana with no family, no references, nothing but her own word, would make an easy foundation to build lies upon. I understand, she said quietly. I'll prepare myself. Good. Foster gathered his papers. In the meantime, I'd advise extreme caution. A man desperate enough to fabricate a criminal record, this elaborate, isn't going to stop at rumors if he believes the hearing will go against him. The rumor once loose in Silver Creek spread with the particular cruelty of small-town gossip growing more elaborate with every retelling. Eleanor felt its effects the very next time she rode into town with Martha needing supplies. Neither of them could put off collecting any longer. The mercantile owner, who'd once turned her away politely, now watched her with open suspicion. A woman she'd exchanged pleasant words with weeks earlier crossed to the other side of the street rather than pass close enough to speak. Children she didn't recognize pointed and whispered their mothers, pulling them along with sharp, disapproving looks aimed squarely at Eleanor. "Ignore them," Martha muttered, though her own jaw was tight with barely contained anger. Small minds believe whatever's easiest to believe. "It's not their fault," Eleanor said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Vale's given them a simple story. A thief hiding among honest folk. It's far easier to believe than the truth that a wealthy, respectable-seeming man has spent years stealing land from families too powerless to stop him. They were nearly finished loading the wagon when a woman. Eleanor recognized the wife of one of Caleb's neighboring ranchers, a woman named Louisa Pratt, who'd been kind to her at a barn dance weeks earlier, approached with visible hesitation. "Miss Whitmore, I wonder if I might have a word." Eleanor braced herself. "Of course. I've heard the stories going around," Louisa said carefully. "About the theft, about the warrant." She glanced around, lowering her voice. "I don't believe them for what it's worth. My husband does business with a lawyer in Helena who looked into the claim on my asking. Says there's no such warrant on record anywhere in Pennsylvania courts. Whoever's spreading that story is lying." Relief flooded through Eleanor so suddenly it nearly buckled her knees. "Thank you. You don't know what that means to me. I know what it looks like watching a whole town turn on someone based on gossip they haven't bothered to verify." Louisa said something bitter in her tone that suggested personal experience with exactly that kind of cruelty. "I won't pretend I can change how everyone else sees this. But you should know not everyone swallowed the story whole." It was a small mercy, but Eleanor carried it home like something precious, a single thread of hope, in a town that had otherwise turned decidedly cold toward her in the space of a single week. The threats escalated 3 days later, and this time they came dressed as something far more dangerous than rumor. Eleanor was in the kitchen when Sam Dawson burst through the door, his face white, his breathing ragged from a hard run across the yard. "Cattle!" he gasped out. "North herd. Someone cut the fence and drove near 30 head off the property overnight. Found the cut wire at first light." Caleb was already moving, shouting for the other hands, and Eleanor felt the familiar cold dread settle back into her stomach. This wasn't rumor anymore. This was direct financial attack precisely calculated to hurt Caleb where a ranch could least afford to be hurt. By midday, the tally was worse than Sam's initial report. 32. Head confirmed missing another 6, found dead in a ravine, 2 miles out, driven off a ledge in the dark by whoever had stolen the rest. The financial loss alone would set the ranch back months. But it was the message underneath the theft that frightened Eleanor most. "He's showing us what he's capable of," she said that evening, watching Caleb pace the length of his office, fury radiating off him in waves. "This is just the beginning, Caleb. If we don't back down." "We're not backing down," Caleb said, cutting her off with more heat than she'd ever heard from him. "I don't care how many cattle he steals or how many lies he spreads through town. I am not handing that man a single document, and I am not letting him drive you out of this territory the way he already tried to do once. I know, I'm not suggesting we back down." Eleanor crossed to him, taking his hands to still his restless pacing. "I'm saying we need to be smarter than he expects. He's escalating because Foster's investigation is closing in faster than he anticipated. That means we're closer to winning this than it feels like right now. Caleb's jaw was tight, but he nodded slowly. Some of the fury banking down into the controlled determination she'd come to recognize as his truest self. Foster wired yesterday. Hearing set for 11 days from now in Bozeman. Judge Ashford's agreed to expedite given the federal interest. 11 days, Eleanor repeated. We just need to survive 11 days. She didn't yet know how much that survival would cost them. The letter arrived 4 days before they were due to leave for Bozeman, delivered this time not beneath the door in the dead of night, but directly into Caleb's hand by a rider who didn't linger long enough to be questioned, spurring his horse away the moment the paper changed hands. Eleanor watched Caleb's face as he read it, watched the color drain slowly from his features, and felt her own heart plummet before he'd said a single word. What is it? Caleb handed her the letter without speaking, and Eleanor's hands began to shake as she read the elegant, familiar handwriting. Miss Whitmore, I understand you intend to testify against me in Bozeman. A regrettable decision, though not an unexpected one, given your evident commitment to this crusade of yours. Before you proceed, I thought it worth sharing a piece of information that may prove relevant to your considerations. Thomas Grayson, the man whose broken engagement I believe delivered you into Mr. Walker's care in the first place, did not simply change his mind about marrying you, Miss Whitmore. He was paid to abandon you. Handsomely, in fact. I have found over the years that most men have a price, and Mr. Grayson's proved quite reasonable. I knew you were traveling west before you ever boarded that train. I simply preferred you arrive already, broken, already desperate, already vulnerable to whatever charity a lonely rancher might offer rather than risk you finding safe harbor somewhere I couldn't easily reach. Everything, since that day on the platform, Miss Whitmore has unfolded rather precisely according to plan. I share this not to frighten you, though I suspect it will, but to remind you that I am not a man who leaves matters to chance. I knew where you would be before you did. I will know exactly where you are for as long as this continues. Reconsider Bozeman. Reconsider testifying at all. Some fights, Miss Whitmore, are not worth the cost of winning them. R.V. Eleanor read the letter twice, her whole body gone numb with a horror so complete it left no room for anything else, not fear, not fury, simply a vast disorienting sense that the ground beneath her entire life these past 2 months had been an illusion carefully constructed by a man she'd never even met in person. He orchestrated it, she whispered. The abandonment. Thomas leaving me on that platform. All of it was Vale. Eleanor. Caleb's voice cut through the numbness, urgent and close. Look at me. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression fierce enough to anchor her against the vertigo threatening to swallow her whole. None of what you found with me is less real because of how it began, Caleb said, his voice rough with conviction. Vale orchestrated the circumstance. He didn't orchestrate what grew out of it. That road that night, whatever calculation Vale made about how broken and desperate you'd be, he didn't account for you being strong enough to still say no when I asked if you wanted charity. He didn't account for the woman who set Robbie's arm without flinching, who stayed up nights sorting my accounts, who walked into Coburn's office with proof strong enough to shake a federal investigation loose. That's not something Vale created, Eleanor. That's entirely you. The words worked their way past the horror slowly, and Eleanor found herself gripping Caleb's hands like an anchor, breathing through the sick vertigo of understanding just how completely she'd been maneuvered. He's telling me this to break me, she said finally, to make me doubt everything, us, this ranch, whether any of it was ever real or whether I simply walked into exactly the trap he built for me. Then don't let him, Caleb said simply. He wants you second-guessing every good thing that's happened since that platform. Don't give him that power. Give him Bozeman instead. Give him a courtroom and a judge, and every piece of proof strong enough to end whatever he's built on other people's stolen lives. Eleanor closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe past the horror, to find the same resolve that had carried her through every closed door in Silver Creek, every threat Vale had sent since. He's frightened, she said, slowly echoing words she'd said once before, weeks earlier, in this very room. A man this desperate to break me before Bozeman, that's not the letter of someone confident he'll win in court, Caleb. That's the letter of a man who knows exactly how much he stands to lose. Then we don't give him any more chances to stop us, Caleb said. We leave for Bozeman tomorrow ahead of schedule. Safer to be moving than sitting still, waiting for whatever he sends next. They left at dawn, a small tense caravan, Caleb Eleanor, Sam Dawson riding armed escort, and Agent Foster meeting them a day's ride out to accompany them the rest of the way into Bozeman. The journey passed in watchful silence, every unfamiliar rider on the horizon, setting Eleanor's pulse racing until they'd confirmed it was simply another traveler unconnected to Vale's reach. By the second night, camped along the trail with Sam. Keeping first watch, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, staring up at a sky thick with stars she still hadn't grown fully accustomed to. "You're thinking about the letter," Caleb said quietly, settling beside her at the dying fire. "I can't stop thinking about it. Every good thing that happened after that platform, I keep wondering how much of it he engineered and how much was simply chance." Eleanor. Caleb's voice was patient, steady, in the way that had become over these past weeks one of the things she trusted most about him. "Vale engineered you standing alone on that platform. He didn't engineer me stopping my horse on that road. That was mine. My choice, same as choosing to keep believing in you every single day since, has been mine." He took her hand in the darkness. "Don't let him steal that from you too, on top of everything else he's already taken." She let his words settle into the fear, easing it just enough to finally close her eyes. And somewhere past midnight, exhausted beyond resistance, she finally slept. Bozeman proved larger and busier than Silver Creek, a proper territorial town, with a courthouse solid enough to hold the weight of what was about to unfold within it. Foster secured the modest lodging near the courthouse, and for 2 days, before the hearing, Eleanor found herself pulled through preparation sessions with a territorial prosecutor named Whitcomb, a sharp, methodical woman who reviewed every document, every date, every detail of Eleanor's testimony with exacting precision. "Vale's lawyer will come at you hard on the theft accusation," Whitcomb warned during their final preparation session the evening before the hearing. "He'll try to establish doubt about your credibility before the judge ever weighs the actual evidence. You need to be ready for that, Miss Whitmore. Calm, unshaken. Let the facts speak louder than his insinuations." "I understand." "Do you?" Whitcomb studied her carefully. "Because I've seen strong witnesses crumble under cross-examination when a skilled lawyer starts picking apart their personal history. He will bring up Thomas Grayson. He will bring up whatever version of your departure from Pennsylvania he's constructed. He will try to make the judge see a desperate, unreliable woman instead of a careful investigator who uncovered genuine fraud." Eleanor thought of Vale's letter of the horrifying revelation that even her abandonment had been engineered, and felt something harden inside her chest. Not fear this time, but a cold, clear resolve. "Let him try," she said. "I've survived worse than a lawyer's questions, Mrs. Whitcomb. I intend to survive this too." The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear, and Eleanor stood outside the Bozeman courthouse with Caleb's hand steady in hers, watching the small crowd already gathering for what had apparently become something of a local spectacle. A wealthy Eastern businessman accused of land fraud by a woman half his social standing, defended by a rancher willing to risk his own mortgage to see justice done. "Ready?" Caleb asked. "No," Eleanor admitted. "But I'm going in anyway." Judge Ashford's courtroom was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, but it filled quickly. Foster and the territorial prosecutor at one table, Vale's lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Pemberton, seated at the other beside Richard Vale himself. It was the first time Eleanor had laid eyes on him in person, and the sight sent a fresh chill through her entire body. He looked exactly as composed, as confident, as untouchable as she remembered from the one occasion she'd glimpsed him years earlier in Pennsylvania, silver-templed, expensively dressed, watching the proceedings with the faint, patient amusement of a man who had never once doubted his own eventual victory. He caught her eye across the courtroom and offered a small, cold smile, as though the entire hearing were nothing more than a mildly tedious inconvenience he intended to weather without breaking stride. Eleanor forced herself to hold his gaze without flinching, and something in her steady refusal to look away seemed to register with him, his smile faltering just slightly before he turned his attention back to his lawyer. The proceedings opened with Foster's testimony, methodical and damning the confirmed cases from Pennsylvania, the wired statements from the Henderson and Miller families, the handwriting analysis that matched Vale's own signature to the forged deeds beyond reasonable doubt. Eleanor watched Judge Ashford's expression carefully, throughout searching for any sign of skepticism, and found instead a growing gravity that suggested the evidence was landing exactly as heavily as Whitcomb had hoped. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She took the stand with her heart hammering, but her voice, when Whitcomb began her questioning, came out steady and clear, carrying her through the discovery of the discrepancies, the months of careful investigation, the mounting horror of understanding the true scale of what Vale had built. "And why did you leave Pennsylvania rather than simply report your findings to local authorities?" Whitcomb asked. "Because I did report them," Eleanor said. "First to a lawyer who I later learned was retained by Mr. Vale himself, then to the county sheriff, who declined to investigate further after what I can only assume was pressure from Mr. Vale's considerable local influence. Within a week of my second attempt to raise the matter, I received a direct threat against my life delivered by a man very similar to the one who has since approached me twice in Montana territory. And you fled to Montana believing yourself safe from Mr. Vale's reach." "I believed so, yes. I have since learned that belief was mistaken." Eleanor kept her voice level, though the words still carried a fresh sting. "I have learned that Mr. Vale was aware of my travel plans before I ever left Pennsylvania. I have learned that the broken engagement which left me stranded in Silver Creek was not an unfortunate coincidence, but a deliberate arrangement paid for by Mr. Vale himself, intended to leave me isolated and vulnerable upon my arrival." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Eleanor saw Judge Ashford's attention sharpen considerably. "That is a significant claim, Miss Whitmore," the judge said. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "I have a letter Your Honor delivered to Walker Ridge Ranch 4 days before this hearing, in which Mr. Vale himself confirms the arrangement in his own handwriting." Eleanor produced the letter, which Foster had already verified against Vale's other documented correspondence. "I would ask that it be entered into evidence." Pemberton rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This letter is unverified, potentially fabricated by the witness herself to bolster an already questionable narrative. The handwriting has already been confirmed to match Mr. Vale's documented signature across 6 other pieces of evidence already entered into this proceeding." Whitcomb interjected smoothly. "I'd invite Mr. Pemberton to have his own expert examine it if he doubts the analysis already provided." Judge Ashford studied the letter for a long moment, his expression growing steadily grimmer as he read through Vale's own confident confession before setting it aside with the deliberate care of a man handling something that had just fundamentally shifted the weight of the proceedings. "Entered into evidence," he said finally. "Mr. Pemberton, your cross-examination." Pemberton rose, adjusting his coat with the practiced confidence of a man who had clearly expected an easier path than the one now unfolding in front of him. "Miss Whitmore, isn't it true that you are currently the subject of an active theft investigation in Pennsylvania?" "No," Eleanor said clearly. "That claim has been thoroughly investigated and found to be entirely fabricated. Agent Foster confirmed no such warrant exists in any Pennsylvania court record. But the rumor exists nonetheless. Started somewhere, did it not? It started, I believe, with Mr. Vale's hired agents spread through Silver Creek in the days following my testimony to Sheriff Coburn, a fabrication designed specifically to undermine my credibility before this very hearing. That's a serious accusation with no evidence beyond your own assertion. Is it more serious than a documented scheme to steal land from 6 confirmed families through forged deeds and manufactured debts? Eleanor met his gaze directly, refusing to let the question rattle her. I would think a man capable of orchestrating my abandonment on a train platform, as confirmed by his own written confession, is entirely capable of orchestrating a false rumor as well. Pemberton's composure flickered just slightly, and Eleanor saw Judge Ashford's mouth tighten in something that might have been the beginning of a smile quickly suppressed. "No further questions," Pemberton said, finally retreating to his table with considerably less confidence than he'd risen with. The hearing stretched across 2 full days. Testimony piling upon testimony, evidence building into something that even Vale's expensive lawyers struggled to unravel. The Henderson family's wired affidavit arrived on the second morning, detailing precisely how their farm had been stolen from beneath them through fabricated debts they'd never actually owed. The Miller's testimony followed that afternoon, corroborating the pattern in devastating detail. Vale himself never took the stand, his lawyer wisely keeping him out of direct testimony that might have exposed him to further damaging cross-examination. But Eleanor watched him throughout the proceedings, watched the careful composure he'd worn on the first day slowly crack under the accumulating weight of evidence, until, by the final afternoon, something colder and more dangerous had replaced his earlier amusement. It was during the closing arguments, as Whitcomb methodically laid out the full scope of Vale's scheme for Judge Ashford's final consideration, that Eleanor caught Vale watching her from across the courtroom, with an expression that sent ice through her veins. Not defeat, but calculation. The look of a man already 3 moves ahead, already planning whatever came next, regardless of what verdict this particular judge might render. She mentioned it to Caleb that evening, back at their lodging, unable to shake the unease it had left behind. "He looked like a man who already knows he's lost this hearing," she said. "But not like a man who's given up the fight entirely." "Foster's already anticipated that," Caleb said, though his own expression carried the same wariness. "Marshals are prepared to take Vale into custody the moment Ashford renders a verdict. If he tries anything before that, he won't try anything obvious," Eleanor said slowly, the horror of his letter still fresh enough to color every calculation she made about him now. "He's shown me exactly how patient and precise he is. If he's planning something, it won't be obvious until it's already happening." Her instinct proved correct faster than either of them expected. The verdict came the following morning, and it came decisively. Judge Ashford's ruling was thorough and damning sufficient evidence to bind Richard Vale over for full criminal trial on charges of fraud, forgery, and extortion across multiple counties, with additional federal charges pending, given the interstate nature of his scheme. The courtroom erupted into murmurs the moment the ruling was read, and Eleanor felt something in her chest finally cautiously begin to loosen after weeks of carrying the weight of this fight. Then everything happened very fast. Vale rose from his table, and for one confused moment, Eleanor thought he intended simply to submit to the marshals already moving toward him. Instead, his hand moved to his coat, and Caleb was on his feet before Eleanor even fully registered the danger, shouting a warning that dissolved into chaos as Vale produced a small pistol and leveled it not at the marshals, not at the judge, but directly at Eleanor. "You should have taken my advice," Vale said, his voice carrying cold and clear across the sudden silence of the courtroom. "Some fights aren't worth the cost." "Vale, don't." Foster's voice urgent, but too far across the room to intervene in time. Caleb moved faster than thought, throwing himself between Eleanor and the leveled pistol, just as Vale's finger tightened on the trigger, and the gunshot that followed seemed to swallow the entire courtroom in a single deafening instant. Eleanor's scream tore from her throat as Caleb staggered, a spreading dark stain blooming rapidly across his shoulder, his knees buckling as 2 marshals finally reached Vale and wrestled the pistol from his grip, forcing him to the ground amid shouted orders and general chaos. "Caleb!" Eleanor caught him as he fell, her hands immediately pressing hard against the wound, the metallic smell of blood and gunpowder filling the air around them as the courtroom dissolved into pandemonium. "Caleb, stay with me. Please stay with me." "Eleanor." His voice came out strained, but his eyes found hers steady, despite the pain etched clearly across his face. "Told you, not facing this alone. Meant that. Every word." "You idiot!" she sobbed, pressing harder against the wound as Foster shouted for a doctor, as Whitcomb knelt beside them, helping to stem the bleeding, as the courtroom around them finally began to settle into the controlled chaos of people responding to genuine emergency. You absolute idiot. You could have let the marshals handle it. Wasn't fast enough. Wasn't willing to risk it. His hand found hers weak but insistent. Told you I'd stand beside you till the end. Didn't say I'd stand still while he aimed a pistol at you. Don't talk. Save your strength. Tears streamed freely down Eleanor's face, now all her carefully maintained composure, finally shattering entirely in the face of watching the man she loved bleeding on a courthouse floor, because he'd thrown himself in front of a bullet meant for her. Please, Caleb, just hold on. A doctor pushed through the gathered crowd, kneeling immediately beside Caleb to assess the wound, and Eleanor found herself pulled gently but firmly aside to make room for the work that needed doing. Whitcomb's arm coming around her shoulders as the doctor began issuing rapid instructions. Shoulder wound, the doctor said after a tense examination. Bullets lodged against the bone but missed anything vital. He'll need surgery to remove it properly, and he's lost considerable blood, but... His eyes met Eleanor's directly, something reassuring in his steady expression. He's going to survive this, miss. I need to get him to my office immediately, but the prognosis is good. Relief crashed through Eleanor so completely, her knees nearly buckled, and it was only Whitcomb's steadying arm that kept her upright as the doctor and two marshals carefully lifted Caleb onto a makeshift stretcher and began the careful process of moving him toward proper medical care. Across the courtroom, Vale was being led away in restraints, his composure finally completely shattered, shouting something about lawyers and appeals that no one in the chaos seemed inclined to listen to. Foster approached Eleanor as the room slowly began to clear, his expression grave, but carrying an undertone of grim satisfaction. Attempted murder in front of a sitting judge and half the Bozeman courthouse. Whatever slim chance Vale had of buying his way out of the fraud charges, that's gone entirely now. He'll spend the rest of his life in federal prison, Miss Whitmore. That much I can promise you. Eleanor barely heard him, her entire focus fixed on the doorway through which they'd carried Caleb, her heart still hammering with residual terror at how close she'd come to losing him entirely. I need to be with him, she said. Go, Foster said gently. I'll handle everything else here. You've done more than enough for one day, Miss Whitmore. More than enough for one lifetime, if I'm honest. The surgery took nearly 2 hours, and Eleanor spent every minute of it pacing the narrow hallway outside the doctor's office, unable to sit still, unable to think of anything beyond the image of Caleb collapsing in front of her, blood spreading rapidly across his shirt, all because he'd chosen without hesitation to place himself between her and a bullet meant to end everything she'd fought so hard to build. When the doctor finally emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth exhaustion etched into his features, but his expression carrying good news, Eleanor felt her whole body sag with relief. Bullets out. Clean removal, no complications. He's resting now, but he'll want to see you, I imagine, soon as he's steady enough. Can I go in? Give him a few minutes. He's still coming around from the ether. The doctor's expression softened slightly. He kept asking for you even half under. Man clearly thinks a great deal of you, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor found Caleb 20 minutes later, pale against the pillows, but breathing steadily, his eyes fluttering open the moment she entered the room. There you are, he murmured, his voice still thick with the lingering effects of the ether. Was starting to worry you'd run off on me. Never, Eleanor said, crossing quickly to sit beside the bed, taking his uninjured hand in both of hers. Never again, Caleb Walker. Not after everything. Good. His eyes drifted closed briefly, then opened again, finding hers with surprising clarity, despite everything his body had just endured. Vale. In federal custody. Attempted murder in front of a judge. Caleb, whatever chance he had of buying his way free of the fraud charges, is entirely gone now. She squeezed his hand gently. You saved my life today. You do understand that, don't you? If you hadn't moved... Wasn't going to let him take you, Caleb said simply, as though the choice had never carried any real weight of deliberation at all. Told you once in the barn. Meant every word then. Mean it more now. Eleanor felt fresh tears threatening, though these carried none of the terror from the courthouse. Only overwhelming exhausted gratitude and love, so complete, it left her momentarily breathless. "I love you," she whispered. "More than I have words for, Caleb. You terrified me today. You terrified me completely, and I have never in my life loved anyone the way I love you right now, watching you lying in this bed because you chose me over your own safety without a single moment's hesitation." "Wasn't a choice," Caleb said, his voice growing heavier with returning exhaustion, though his grip on her hand remained steady. "Some things aren't choices, Eleanor. Loving you stopped being a choice somewhere around that third week. Protecting you stopped being a choice the moment I understood what that meant." His eyes drifted closed again, sleep finally claiming him, despite his evident effort to stay present. "Just glad it worked out. Glad you're safe." Eleanor stayed beside him long after his breathing evened into genuine sleep. Her hand still wrapped around his, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, with a gratitude so profound it felt like its own kind of prayer. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of the doctor's small office, Richard Vale sat in federal custody. His scheme finally completely unraveled, the 6 families he'd stolen from finally within reach of whatever justice the courts could still provide them. And somewhere in the quiet of that small room, Eleanor Whitmore understood with a clarity that settled deep into her bones that whatever came next, however long Caleb's recovery took, however the remaining legal proceedings against Vale unfolded, however many months it took Walker Ridge to fully recover from the damage of these past weeks, none of it frightened her the way it once might have, because she was no longer facing any of it alone. She had a home now, a real one built not on careful letters from a stranger, but on honest work, hard-won trust, and a man who had proven in the most literal and terrifying way possible exactly how far he was willing to go to keep his promise that she would never again stand alone on an empty platform, wondering if anyone was coming for her. Someone had come. And whatever scars this fight against Richard Vale left behind on Caleb's shoulder, on the ranch's finances, on the careful peace they'd both been building since that first night on the dark road, Eleanor intended to spend the rest of her life grateful for every single one of them, proof, as they were, of a love that had chosen her completely and without hesitation when it mattered most. Caleb's recovery stretched across 9 days in Bozeman before the doctor pronounced him fit enough to travel, and Eleanor spent every one of those days at his bedside, leaving only when Whitcomb or Foster insisted she eat something, sleep somewhere other than a hard chair. Remember that she too had survived something no woman should have to survive. "You're hovering," Caleb told her on the 4th morning, his color returning, his voice steadier than it had been since the courthouse. "I can see it in your face. You think if you look away, something else is going to happen. Can you blame me?" Eleanor didn't look up from the bandage she was carefully rewrapping around his shoulder, her hands more skilled at the task now than she'd ever wanted to become. "I watched a man aim a pistol at me, and you throw yourself in front of it without so much as a second's hesitation. Forgive me if I'm not eager to let you out of my sight just yet. Wasn't planning on giving you reason to worry again." Caleb caught her hand as she finished the bandage, holding it against his chest over the steady beat of his heart. "Vale's locked up. Cases closed far as the criminal proceedings go. Foster says there's nothing left standing between us and going home." "Home," Eleanor repeated softly, testing the word the way she'd tested it 100 times these past 2 months, still faintly amazed at how naturally it had come to mean Walker Ridge meant. Him meant a life she'd never dared imagine for herself, standing on that empty depot platform. "Home," Caleb confirmed, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice settled deep into her chest, warm and solid as anything she'd ever known. They made the journey back to Silver Creek slowly, Caleb's shoulder still healing enough that Foster insisted on an easy pace, and Eleanor found herself grateful for every extra hour. It gave them a kind of gentle decompression after weeks of fear that had finally completely broken. Sam Dawson met them at the edge of the ranch road, his weathered face breaking into something rare and unguarded when he caught sight of Caleb upright and mending in the wagon seat beside Eleanor. "Heard what happened," Sam said, falling into step beside the wagon as they made their way toward the house. "Whole territory's talking about it. Rancher takes a bullet for the woman he loves right in front of a federal judge. He shook his head, something like awe in his weathered features. Didn't figure you for the dramatic type, Caleb. Wasn't planning on it, Caleb said dryly, though the pain in his voice was easing day by day. Circumstances demanded it. Well, Sam glanced at Eleanor, something warm and approving in his gaze that hadn't been there those first uncertain weeks. Ranch missed you both. Martha's been baking like she's feeding an army waiting on you to come home. Home. There it was again, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten as Walker Ridge came into view at last, the low sprawling house, the barn beyond it. The fields stretching gold and green under the Montana sun. It looked exactly as it had the night Caleb first brought her here, exhausted and terrified, and clutching nothing but a suitcase and a folded letter. It felt entirely different now. Martha was waiting on the porch before the wagon had even fully stopped, her apron dusted with flour, her face already crumpling with relief the moment she saw Caleb sitting upright beside Eleanor. "You foolish man," Martha said, hurrying down the steps, despite her considerable age wrapping Caleb in a fierce embrace the moment he'd climbed carefully down from the wagon. "Taking a bullet like some storybook hero. Nearly gave me a fit of apoplexy when Sam rode in with the news." "Good to see you too, Martha," Caleb said, wincing slightly, but returning the embrace with his good arm. "And you." Martha turned to Eleanor, next pulling her into an embrace equally fierce, equally relieved. "Lord, child, I prayed harder these past 2 weeks than I have in 20 years. You're both home safe. That's all that matters now." Eleanor let herself sink into the embrace, into the warmth of a welcome she'd never expected to find waiting for her anywhere, and felt something in her chest finally completely settle the last of the fear, the last of the vigilance, the last of the careful bracing she'd been carrying since that first terrible letter arrived beneath the ranch's front door. They were home. And for the first time since the platform, Eleanor believed without reservation that home was exactly where she belonged. The weeks that followed brought their own quiet reckonings. Word came from Foster 3 weeks after their return that Richard Vale, facing overwhelming evidence and the additional weight of attempted murder charges, had accepted a plea that guaranteed him life imprisonment, rather than risk a trial that might have ended in execution. The 6 confirmed families, the Hendersons, the Millers, and 4 others whose stolen land Eleanor's documents had finally exposed, began the slow process of reclaiming what had been taken from them, aided by a federal restitution fund established from the liquidation of Vale's considerable assets. "You did that," Caleb told her, reading the letter aloud on the porch one evening, his shoulder healed enough now that he'd stopped favoring it quite so carefully. 6 families getting their land back, Eleanor. That's not a small thing. That's not something most people would have had the courage to see through, not after everything it cost you. "It cost us," Eleanor corrected gently. "I didn't do any of it alone, Caleb. Not the running, not the hiding, not standing in that courtroom. You were beside me every step, right up until you nearly died proving it." Fair point. Something rueful crossed his face, though the warmth beneath it never wavered. "Guess we did it together then." "We did?" Eleanor settled closer against his good shoulder, watching the sunset spread gold and violet across the western ridgeline, the same view that had greeted her that first terrifying evening, transformed now into something achingly familiar, achingly beloved. "I keep thinking about that letter. The one Vale sent about Thomas Grayson being paid to abandon me." Caleb's arm tightened around her. "You still thinking about that? Less than I was. But I keep coming back to it, wondering what kind of person I'd have become if things had gone the way Vale intended. If I'd arrived in Silver Creek and simply been left to wither alone and broken exactly as he planned." She shook her head slowly. "He built an entire scheme around breaking me down before I ever set foot in Montana, and instead I found you." "He didn't plan for me," Caleb said quietly. Man like Vale, calculating every angle, buying off every weak point he could find, he never once considered that the woman he meant to leave, stranded and desperate, might stumble onto someone who'd refuse to let her stay that way. "No," Eleanor agreed, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. "He never accounted for you at all." Autumn arrived early that year, painting the ranch in shades of amber and rust, and with it came a different kind of reckoning. the quiet, unhurried question of what came next, now that the danger had finally completely passed. Eleanor found herself increasingly restless in ways she hadn't expected watching Caleb across the kitchen table some evenings, with a question sitting unspoken behind her ribs, uncertain how to voice something that felt after everything they'd survived together, both entirely obvious and terrifyingly vulnerable, to say aloud first. Caleb, it turned out, was carrying the same question. He found her on the porch one crisp October evening, the same spot where so much of their story had unfolded these past months, and settled into the chair beside her, with something uncharacteristically nervous in his usually steady demeanor. "Eleanor, I've been thinking." "That sounds serious." "It is." He turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her heart begin to race, some anticipation she couldn't quite name, but felt building nonetheless. "You came to this territory believing you were traveling toward a marriage. Circumstances made certain that particular arrangement never came to pass." Eleanor's breath caught. "Caleb, let me finish, please." He reached for her hand, his grip warm and slightly unsteady, an echo of nervousness that felt strange and endearing coming from a man who'd faced down a leveled pistol without flinching. "I've spent 6 years since Sarah passed believing I'd closed that particular door in my life for good. Told myself I didn't need it, didn't want the risk of losing someone again the way I lost her. Told myself the ranch, the work that was enough to build a life around. And now, I can't imagine a single day of the rest of my life that doesn't have you in it," Caleb said, his voice rough with the kind of honesty she'd come to recognize as entirely fundamentally him. "You walked into my life on a road in the dark, carrying nothing but a suitcase, and more courage than I think you even understood you had. You've spent every day since proving exactly what kind of woman you are: strong enough to set a boy's broken arm, brave enough to stand against a man with more money and power than either of us could easily fight, and generous enough to love a broken-down rancher who'd forgotten how to let anyone close enough to matter." Eleanor felt tears building warm and overwhelming as Caleb shifted, wincing slightly at the pull against his healing shoulder, and lowered himself carefully onto one knee in front of her chair. "I'm not Thomas Grayson," he said, producing a small, simple ring from his coat pocket, the metal catching the last of the evening light. "I'm not going to write you letters full of promises and then leave you standing alone when the moment comes to actually keep them. I'm asking you now plainly to my face exactly the way it should have been asked from the start. Eleanor Whitmore, will you marry me?" The question hung in the crisp autumn air, and Eleanor found herself laughing and crying at once, the sound catching somewhere between overwhelming joy and the release of months of accumulated fear, finally completely dissolving into something purely simply happy. "Yes," she said, pulling him up with both hands, despite his protests about his shoulder, wrapping her arms around him with a fierceness that spoke to every fear she'd carried since that platform. Every doubt, Vale's cruel machinations, had tried to plant every careful wall she'd built and watched Caleb patiently, steadily dismantle over these past months. Yes, Caleb Walker, 1,000 times, yes. Yeah, they married in November, a small ceremony held in the ranch house's front room, decorated simply with the last of the autumn wildflowers Martha had insisted on gathering, despite the season's chill. Sheriff Coburn stood as witness alongside Sam Dawson and Louisa Pratt. The neighbor who'd offered Eleanor kindness during the town's darkest whispers sat proudly among the small gathering of guests who'd traveled out to Walker Ridge for the occasion. Eleanor wore a simple dress Martha had helped her sew from fabric purchased in town. Nothing like the elaborate wedding she might once have imagined for herself back in Pennsylvania, back before everything had changed so completely. She found standing at the front of that small room, with Caleb's steady hand in hers, that she wouldn't have traded it for anything grander in the world. "Do you, Caleb Walker, take this woman?" Eleanor barely heard the particulars of the ceremony, too, caught up in the steady warmth of Caleb's eyes fixed on hers, too overwhelmed by the journey that had carried her from an empty platform in despair to this small, warm room filled with people who had over these past months become something she'd never expected to find again after everything her old life had taken from her. Family. Not blood, but chosen, built slowly and deliberately from honest work and hard-won trust, and a love that had proven itself in the most literal, terrifying way a person could prove such a thing. "I do," Caleb said, his voice steady and sure. "And do you, Eleanor Whitmore, take this man?" "I do," Eleanor said before the officiant had even finished the question, drawing a warm ripple of laughter from the small gathered crowd, and Caleb's answering smile was the last thing she saw clearly, before he pulled her close and the ceremony dissolved into the simple, overwhelming joy of two people who had fought harder than either of them ever expected to find exactly this, marshals. That evening, once the small gathering had finally dispersed, and Martha had shooed away the last of the well-wishers with the particular firmness of a woman who understood exactly when newly married couples deserved privacy, Eleanor stood beside Caleb on the porch, watching the last light fade behind the mountains, exactly as it had that first terrifying evening months earlier. "I remember that day," Caleb said quietly, echoing words she recognized, words that had lived in her memory since that first conversation on this very porch. "The day you walked away from the train station with nothing but a suitcase and more courage than you probably realized you had." Eleanor smiled, leaning into his good shoulder, feeling the steady warmth of him beside her permanent now, in ways that still occasionally left her breathless with gratitude. "I thought that was the moment my life ended. Standing on that platform, reading 4 sentences that told me the future I'd crossed a country for had simply evaporated. And now I understand it wasn't the end of anything." She turned to look at him, fully memorizing the lines of his face in the fading light, the same face that had looked at her that first night, with nothing but honesty and the offer of a chance. "It was the moment I found my way here, to you, to this ranch, to a family I never expected to have again after everything I lost back in Pennsylvania." Caleb's arm tightened around her, drawing her closer against the evening chill. "Why did you trust me that first night, a stranger on a dark road offering work to a woman he'd never met? Most people would have kept walking." Eleanor considered the question seriously, searching back through the fear and desperation of that first terrible evening, trying to find the exact moment she'd decided to trust a stranger's offer over the safety of continued caution. "Because you didn't promise me anything," she said finally. "Every man before you had promised me the world and delivered nothing but disappointment. You offered me honest work and a locked door, and you told me plainly it was my choice, always would be, as long as I was on your land. I think some part of me recognized even then that a man who refused to promise more than he could deliver was exactly the kind of man worth trusting with everything else." "Smart woman," Caleb murmured, pressing a gentle kiss against her temple. "I try." Eleanor closed her eyes, breathing in the crisp evening air, the familiar scent of wood smoke and horses and home that had become over these past months as essential to her as breathing itself. "Why did you stop that night, Caleb, really? Beyond simply recognizing someone with nowhere to go?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his hand tracing slow, absent circles against her shoulder. "Honestly, I'd told myself for 6 years I didn't need anyone. That the ranch, the work that was enough to build a life around, and anything more than that, was just asking for the kind of pain I'd already survived once and had no interest in surviving again." His voice grew rougher, more unguarded. "Then I saw you on that road, carrying yourself like you refused to let the world see you break, even though it clearly already had, and something in me simply couldn't ride past. Couldn't leave you standing there the way I imagine plenty of other people in this territory would have. I'm grateful you didn't." "So am I." He turned her gently to face him fully, his expression carrying the same steady honesty that had drawn her to trust him from that very first night. "I spent 6 years believing I'd close the door on ever loving anyone again. You didn't just open that door, Eleanor. You walked straight through it and made yourself so thoroughly at home, I couldn't imagine closing it again if I tried." "Home," Eleanor repeated softly, the word carrying every ounce of meaning it had accumulated over these past extraordinary months. "Home." Caleb confirmed, his hand coming up to gently cup her face. "You asked me once that first night why I offered you work, instead of simply riding past. I told you it was because I recognized what it looked like when someone had nowhere to go." His thumb traced softly along her cheekbone. I understand now it was something more than that, even if I wasn't ready to admit it to myself at the time. Some part of me recognized that very first night that you were exactly what this ranch, what my life had been missing since the day I buried Sarah and told myself I'd never need anything more than hard work to fill the silence. Eleanor felt tears building again, warm and overwhelming, and let them fall freely this time, unashamed, surrounded by a love that had proven itself worth every fear she'd overcome to reach it. "I was looking for a home," she whispered, echoing words that felt like the truest thing she'd ever said. "I crossed an entire country believing Thomas Grayson's letters would give me that. Instead, I found it standing on a dark road with a stranger who offered me nothing but honest work and the truth." "So was I," Caleb said softly, pulling her fully into his arms, the warmth of him chasing away every last remnant of the cold, uncertain fear that had once defined her arrival in this territory. "Looking for exactly the same thing longer than I probably let myself understand." Winter settled over Walker Ridge with its usual harsh beauty, but Eleanor found herself facing the season without any of the dread she might once have carried into an unfamiliar Montana winter. The ranch hummed with a different kind of energy. Now Robbie's arm fully healed, strong enough that he'd taken to bragging about the doctor who'd complimented Eleanor's work. Sam Dawson overseeing the herd's careful management through the difficult months with the steady competence that had made him invaluable long before Eleanor ever arrived. Martha ruling the kitchen with Eleanor as full partner now, rather than simply hired help, the two of them having built over these past months a friendship as solid as any Eleanor had ever known. The families Vale had wronged began slowly to write letters of their own. The Hendersons first, then the Millers, each carrying news of land reclaimed, debts, finally officially voided, lives slowly rebuilding from the wreckage Vale's greed had left behind. "We will never be able to properly thank you, Miss Whitmore," the Henderson matriarch wrote in one particularly moving letter. "You risked everything to see justice done for families you'd never even met. That kind of courage deserves to be remembered, whatever else this world tries to teach us about looking away from suffering that isn't our own." Eleanor read the letter aloud to Caleb one evening, her voice thick with emotion by the time she finished. "You should be proud of that," Caleb said, watching her carefully across the kitchen table. 6 families with their lives back. That's not a small legacy, Eleanor." "I don't feel particularly heroic," Eleanor admitted. "Mostly I just feel grateful. Grateful I survived it. Grateful I found you in the middle of it. Grateful the fear finally actually ended instead of simply following me forever the way I feared it might." "That's its own kind of heroism," Caleb said gently. "The willingness to keep fighting even when you're terrified. Even when the fear feels like it might swallow you whole." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You taught me something too, you know. Something I'd forgotten since Sarah passed." "What's that?" "That love isn't really about avoiding the risk of loss. It's about deciding the risk is worth taking anyway, because the alternative, closing yourself off entirely, refusing to let anyone close enough to matter, that's its own kind of loss. Slower maybe, quieter, but no less real." His grip tightened around her hand. "I spent 6 years choosing that quieter loss because I was too afraid to risk the other kind again. You walked into my life and reminded me exactly what I'd been missing." Eleanor felt her heart swell with a love so complete it left her briefly breathless, even now, months into a marriage built on the sturdiest foundation she'd ever known. "I'm glad I did." "So am I," Caleb said, and the simple, unguarded warmth of his smile carried every promise he'd made her that first night on the dark road, every promise he'd kept in the months since. Every promise she trusted completely, he would continue keeping for as long as they both drew breath. Spring arrived at Walker Ridge with the particular explosive beauty of Montana's short, intense growing season, and with it came news that Eleanor had in some quiet corner of her heart begun to hope for without quite daring to speak aloud. Caleb. She found him in the barn mending tack with the easy competence that had become so familiar to her over these past months, and something in her voice must have carried enough weight to make him set down his work immediately, his full attention turning to her. "What is it?" Eleanor felt a smile breaking across her face, unable to contain the joy building in her chest. I'm going to have a baby. The tack fell from Caleb's hands entirely forgotten, and for one suspended moment, he simply stared at her. Something between shock and overwhelming joy, transforming his features before he crossed the space between them and swept her carefully into his arms. Are you certain? The doctor confirmed it yesterday in town. I wanted to be certain before I told you. Eleanor laughed through sudden tears, holding him close. We're going to have a child, Caleb, a family, a real one built on everything we've fought so hard to earn. A family. Caleb repeated, his voice, rough with emotion, he made no effort to hide. God, Eleanor, after everything, after Sarah, after believing I'd never have this again, you have it now, Eleanor said softly, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes fully. We have it now. Together. Caleb's hand came to rest gently against her still flat stomach, something reverent and awestruck in the gesture, and Eleanor watched 6 years of careful grief finally completely give way to something entirely new, hope, undiluted and unafraid, taking root in a man who had spent so long believing himself closed off from exactly this kind of joy. I love you. Caleb said, his voice thick with the accumulated weight of everything they'd survived together to reach this moment. More than I have words for, Eleanor Walker. You gave me back everything I thought I'd lost forever, and now you're giving me something new besides. We're giving each other something new, Eleanor corrected gently. Both of us. Together the way we've done everything since that first night on the road. The baby came in late autumn, nearly a year to the day since Eleanor had first stepped off that train onto an empty depot platform, convinced her life had reached its lowest possible point. Caleb never left her side through the long, difficult hours of labor, his steady presence anchoring her through pain that felt, at its worst moments, like it might genuinely overwhelm her entirely. When the doctor finally placed their daughter into Eleanor's exhausted arms, small and perfect and impossibly loud, Eleanor felt every fear, every doubt, every terrible memory of that abandoned platform dissolve completely into something purely overwhelmingly joyful. She's perfect, Caleb whispered, kneeling beside the bed, one hand gently touching the impossibly small fingers of their daughter's tiny fist. What should we name her? Eleanor asked, exhausted beyond measure, but utterly completely happy. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying the small, perfect face of their daughter, with an expression Eleanor had never seen on him before, pure, unguarded wonder. 6 years of careful grief, finally completely transformed into this. Grace, he said finally, for everything that brought us here, for every hard road that somehow against every reasonable expectation led us both to exactly this. Grace, Eleanor agreed softly, watching their daughter's small face scrunch and settle in her arms. It's perfect. That evening, once Grace had finally settled into peaceful sleep, and Martha had shooed the exhausted new parents toward much-needed rest, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, despite her overwhelming exhaustion, her mind circling back one final time to the empty platform that had once felt like the absolute end of every hope she'd ever carried. She thought of Thomas Grayson's cruel, engineered abandonment, of Richard Vale's careful, calculated cruelty, believing he could break her simply by orchestrating her isolation and desperation, of every closed door in Silver Creek during those first terrible days, every moment she'd believed herself entirely hopelessly alone in a world that had already taken everything from her once before. None of it had broken her. None of it had even come close in the end to the life she'd actually found waiting for her on that dark road in the offer of a guarded rancher who'd asked for nothing but honest work and given her in return everything she'd never dared hope to find again. Caleb stirred beside her, his hand finding hers in the darkness, warm and familiar, and entirely permanently hers. Can't sleep, he murmured. Just thinking, Eleanor said softly, about everything that brought us here. About how close I came to believing that platform was the end of everything good in my life. And now, Eleanor turned to look at him in the soft darkness of their room, at the man who had proven time and again exactly what kind of promise was worth trusting. Steady, honest, willing to bleed for her, when the moment demanded it, patient enough to slowly, carefully rebuild everything Vale's cruelty had tried to destroy. "Now I understand it wasn't the end of anything at all," she said. "It was simply the beginning of finding you." Caleb pulled her close, careful of Grace sleeping soundly in the small cradle beside their bed, and pressed a gentle kiss against her forehead. "You're not just welcome here, Eleanor," he said softly, echoing words that had lived between them since that first extraordinary evening on the porch. Words that had only grown more true with every day, every trial, every hard-won victory they'd claimed together since. "You never were just welcome. You're my home." Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the words settle into her chest, exactly where they belonged, the final complete answer to every question that empty platform had once seemed to ask her about. Whether she would ever truly belong anywhere again. She had crossed an entire country, searching for a home built on a stranger's careful promises, only to find that home waiting instead on a dark Montana road, offered freely by a man who had never once needed to promise her anything beyond the simple, steady truth of who he was. And in the quiet warmth of that small room, surrounded by everything she had fought so hard to build, a husband who had proven his love with his own blood. A daughter who carried forward every ounce of hope that fight had won, a family built not on chance or convenient circumstance, but on courage, honesty, and a love strong enough to survive anything a cruel and desperate man could throw against it. Eleanor Whitmore. Walker finally completely believed what she had once only dared to hope. She belonged here, fully, permanently, beyond any doubt that could ever again take root in her heart. She was home.